Within minutes of hitting rank 4, Richard shot straight to rank 1. His score didn't climb. It exploded, jumping past everyone until it settled at a clean 1,000 points. For someone in the ethereal realm, this wasn't impressive. It was expected. The Dark Forest was built as a trial zone for kids who hadn't reached that stage yet. Honestly, it felt like cheating, like walking into a beginner dungeon with endgame stats. But the forest didn't care about cultivation. It only cared about age. And by that rule, Richard still had 10 more years before he'd be banned from entering. That's enough, he muttered. With a single thought, he dismissed his shadow lions. They scattered instantly, dissolving into the air like smoke being erased. He walked toward the gate at an unhurried pace. Not a single beast dared to show itself anymore. Everything in the forest had already been scared into hiding by that earlier roar. Soon, the exit gates appeared. The moment Richard stepped out, he saw the crowd. People were frozen in place, staring at the glowing rankings on the wall as if the numbers might change if they blinked. Seriously? Richard sighed. Even the Sky Armor Knights had returned and were pretending nothing had happened, but their eyes betrayed them. Wide-eyed disbelief. The kind you don't forget. Richard couldn't be bothered. He walked right past them and headed for the alley where Olivia was waiting. The reward didn't come from the knights anyway. It came from the city lord. And to get it without trouble, Richard needed Olivia. The moment Richard entered the alley, Olivia grabbed his hand. Whoosh! The world turned into a blur. Her movement was absurd. Richard couldn't even see the streets, only flashes of shadow and light. A heartbeat later, they were inside a luxurious house filled with antiques and polished shelves that gleamed softly. "You're safe here," Olivia said, smiling like this was routine. Richard started removing the phantom cloak, and Olivia took it back immediately, quick as a thief. "Everyone will realize you've reached the ethereal realm," she said. "Your name is going to shake the place. But with how many kids are named Richard, no one will pin down who you are." Richard pulled out his token. "Can you claim my reward?" Olivia snatched it with a playful laugh. "Of course. The city lord is a friend. He won't force you to reveal anything." Then she tilted her head. "By the way, did you find the necklace?" Richard pulled out the black chain, the pendant shaped like a skull. "This?" Olivia grabbed it even faster than the cloak and the token, like she was scared he'd change his mind. Her face lit up so brightly it looked like she might actually start dancing. Richard didn't smile. "My payment," he reminded her. "Relax," she said, still grinning, and handed him a vial filled with deep red liquid. Richard held it up, studying it. He loved his horse, Athena. If this could help her evolve into a primordial beast, it was worth everything. "This will really work?" he asked. "It's a bloodline potion," Olivia replied. "Of course it works." Richard hesitated, then pointed at the skull pendant. "Then why didn't you take the necklace yourself? If you wanted it that badly, you could have gone into the forest." Olivia answered casually, like she was explaining the weather. "That necklace is a slave seal. Once it's bound with my blood, anyone who wears it becomes my servant." Richard's eyes widened. A slave seal. If he'd known that earlier, he wouldn't have handed it over so easily. A thin line of caution slid into his thoughts. Would she try to use it on him? But Olivia simply tucked it away without a hint of hostility. No explanation. No reassurance. Just confidence. Richard narrowed his eyes. That pendant had belonged to someone. Someone strong enough to enslave the creature buried in that grave. And yet it had been buried with the body untouched. Which meant either the owner wasn't there when it died, or the people who buried it were too terrified to take anything. Either way, Richard had ended up retrieving it for her. Watching Olivia smile, he couldn't shake the feeling he'd been played like a child. Patience, he told himself. He still needed her to claim the reward from the city lord. After that, he'd settle the score. "All right," Olivia said, standing. "I'll go to the city lord. Stay here." She opened a window overlooking a narrow alley, stepped through, and vanished instantly. The speed she displayed made Richard realize something uncomfortable. Mrs. Wilson was fast. Olivia was on another level entirely. Richard sat down and waited without moving. It would be nice if I had a storage artifact, he thought. The city lord lived in the heart of Appletown, inside a lavish castle guarded by countless soldiers. He was young, early 30s, and he'd earned his position through real achievements, not inheritance. Handsome, blonde hair neatly kept, and a smile that never seemed to leave his face. Liam. Olivia appeared directly in the main hall, cutting through the room like she owned it. The city lord looked up surprised. Olivia? You picked a bad time. I'm busy. I'm here for a reward claim, Olivia said, tossing Richard's token to him. Liam caught it, and his expression changed instantly. His eyes widened. You know who this boy is? He asked carefully. I do, Olivia replied. And I'm not telling anyone. Liam's smile faded. Olivia's tone turned sharp. Don't investigate this. It'll be better for you. Unless you want trouble you can't handle. That warning wiped the warmth off Liam's face completely. He stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. Fine. He retrieved a large glass case. Inside sat a skull that looked like it had been carved from diamond. Olivia took it without hesitation and vanished again, so fast that even Liam couldn't react. He stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd been. She's hiding that boy somewhere, he thought. And if he really wanted to find him, he could. Appletown was his territory. Tracking who Olivia met, where she went, what houses she entered, it was all possible. But Olivia's warning echoed in his mind. And for the first time in a long time, Liam felt cautious. Richard didn't wait long. Olivia slipped back through the same window she'd used to leave, moving like a shadow. In her hands was a glass case, and inside it sat a skull. For a split second, Richard honestly thought it was a huge diamond carved into the shape of a head. Olivia set the case down in front of him. Here. This is what you earned. Richard didn't waste time with words. He lifted the lid, reached in, and took the skull out. It looked solid. Heavy. Valuable. But the moment it touched his palm, he realized it weighed almost nothing, like hardened cotton pretending to be stone. And then his body reacted. Not fear. Not hesitation. A craving. A violent instinct that screamed one thing: absorb it. So he did. The skull dissolved into sparkling light, flowing into his head as if it had always belonged there. Ding! Your skull bone has been replaced with an ether skull bone. You gain an additional 1,000 ether accumulation derived from the ether skull bone. Ether accumulation, 2,000 tier 3. The numbers weren't small. Each section of the skeleton, once replaced with ether bone, granted a flat 1,000 ether accumulation, matching the tier of what he absorbed. Skull, limbs, torso, for major parts. 4,000 total if he completed the set. At the peak of the Etherwell realm, a Magus could reach 15,000 ether accumulation, and even more with special methods. Richard had only been sitting at 1,000. One skull alone doubled him. And, because he hadn't absorbed any ether since advancing, the boost felt even sharper, like a leap instead of a slow climb. But the real gain wasn't the number. It was what came with it. A new sense awakened inside him, something beyond sight and hearing. A sixth sense. He could perceive without eyes, hear without ears, even speak without opening his mouth. Not exactly telepathy, but close. Cleaner. More controllable. He could project his voice straight into someone's mind. That was why the skull mattered more than any other bone. Olivia smiled, genuinely pleased. Congrats. You just got a lot stronger. Richard's voice stayed flat. It's fine. Olivia leaned against the window frame, studying him like he was something interesting she hadn't figured out yet. You must be bored here. Appletown is tiny for someone like you. You'd fit better in Valley Night City. That's where the real talents gather. She paused, then added with a playful edge. Of course, in a place like that, you'd be fighting older kids. Richard shook his head. Not interested. Oh. Olivia's eyes gleamed like she'd caught a hidden meaning. So it's not fear, it's a reason. Richard stood. Can I leave now? Sure, she said lightly. It's not even my house. Nothing here is holding you. Richard's expression twitched. He walked to the door. And the moment he opened it, he stopped. William stood there, with his maid Elsa behind him. Both froze when they saw Richard. Then William's face twisted into anger. "You little brat. How dare you break into my aunt's house?" Richard didn't answer. He glanced back instinctively. Olivia was gone. Just gone. A curse rose in his mind. "I'll pay her back for this." He turned back to William, looking almost tired. Then he pushed William with one small hand. The motion looked harmless. But William flew back and hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Young master!" Elsa screamed, rushing to him. Richard didn't stay to talk. He slipped into a side alley and vanished into the maze of streets. By now, he understood something clearly. Living around people meant trouble was constant. A new problem always found you. Only in Purple Rose Village did he get peace, because nobody there dared to test him. He moved fast through twisting alleys until he reached Mr. Joe's place. The old man was asleep on the sofa. Richard tapped his shoulder. Joe jolted awake. "Boss? Let's go," Richard said. "We're heading home." "Now." Joe blinked, confused. Richard didn't explain. He just walked toward the door. If Joe didn't follow, Richard would leave him behind. Outside, Athena was awake, calmly chewing grass. Richard climbed onto her back. Joe panicked and scrambled after him. "Wait, boss." He clambered up behind, breathless. Only then did Athena begin moving. Richard kept her pace steady. Sprinting through the city would just attract more eyes, more questions, more problems. As for William, Richard barely spared him another thought. Nothing was stolen. No real crime. Even if William wanted revenge, he'd have to find Richard first. And that wasn't easy. As they rode toward the city gates, Richard tested his new gift. Whoosh! His sixth sense spread outward, covering 20 meters in every direction. Invisible. Undetectable. To everyone else, nothing changed. To Richard, the world opened up. He could see details with his eyes half closed. Hear conversations he wasn't facing. Track movement like it was drawn in lines around him. And most importantly, he could speak mind to mind. He already knew what he wanted to do next. Spread a rumor. A clean story that put the truth where it belonged. Olivia had forced him to retrieve the slave seal from the dark forest grave, and he'd handed it to her. But he needed the right place. A crowd. Richard glanced at Joe. "Old man. That cat's grave in the dark forest. Do you know anything about it?" Joe nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've heard. They say it belonged to Lady Rebecca. A primordial beast, smart as a man. She bought it at a huge price, enslaved it, and used it like a personal messenger." Joe swallowed, lowering his voice. "A week ago, she sent it to Appletown to gather more beasts for the dark forest. Under its command, even wild creatures became tame. But then the cat suddenly died here. Some say it was poisoned. Lady Rebecca didn't come. Maybe she was busy. She just ordered the city lord to bury it." Richard's eyes sharpened. So it connected back to Rebecca. To his mother. And suddenly, the pieces made an ugly kind of sense. If the slave seal was buried with the body, it might have been bait. A trap. A way to expose whoever touched it. Because there was nothing else worth stealing from that cat. Olivia had used him. She probably assumed a 7-year-old wouldn't think this deep. Richard's jaw tightened. Cunning fox. I should have expected it, considering how she makes her money. Ahead, the city's great gate came into view. It was midday. People streamed in and out constantly, a perfect mix of merchants, travelers, guards, and villagers. Richard nodded to himself. Perfect. This was the right place to let the story spread.
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support, we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
As he passed through the gate, Richard blended into the crowd. His small figure quickly disappeared from sight. There were also many children from nearby villages, brought along by their parents. "I am Richard, the one who gathered 1,000 points in the Forest of Darkness." I was forced by Olivia Skylight to take the slave seal from Lady Rebecca's cat's corpse, and that seal is now in her hands. Richard sent the message to everyone within a 20-meter radius. Most of the people there knew nothing about him, since they hadn't even heard of the incident in the northern forest of darkness, but whether they knew or not was irrelevant. Now they knew, and it was certain to become a topic of discussion. Richard didn't care even if Olivia exposed his identity, because there was nothing wrong with who he was. Who just spoke? Someone wondered. Richard? Did he really gather 1,000 points in the Forest of Darkness? So he was the one who took the slave seal? How bold. It was Olivia Skylight who forced him. Could it be that woman who poisoned Lady Rebecca's cat? While people whispered, Richard was already gone, and Mr. Joe hadn't heard anything. He mounted his horse and spurred it faster. The words he had spoken spread quickly, merging with the other rumor that he was only 7 years old. The more people spoke, the faster it reached Olivia's ears, who was almost never still, always roaming the town. She had just stepped out of a shop when she overheard a group talking. Olivia Skylight, I always knew she was daring. She's been toying with stronger people since long ago, but they all failed to teach her a lesson. In the end, she even surpassed them. But this time, she's in serious trouble. When her name was mentioned, Olivia instinctively froze mid-step, though the people speaking hadn't noticed her. Most likely she's the one who poisoned Lady Rebecca's cat. Appletown isn't that big, there aren't many who could do such a thing. But to provoke Lady Rebecca, things won't end well for that woman. I think she wasn't so smart this time. Forcing a child to act for her, only for that child to expose her secret. But that boy is incredible too. He's only 7, yet it seems he's already a true magus. Yes, his power is far too great. The only explanation is that he already has an ether will to control all his gathered ether. Richard, he's actually. Olivia's cheeks flushed as she realized what had happened. How could he have told others? How could he even say she forced him? Weren't they supposed to be partners? Hadn't she paid him with something valuable? Whoosh! Overcome with unease, Olivia vanished. The distance between Appletown and Night Valley City might seem far, but great news traveled quickly. Some people sent messages via carrier pigeons that flew at astonishing speeds. Within just a few hours, Richard's name spread among the upper circles of Night Valley City. A 7-year-old boy who had already reached the realm of Etherwill, such a thing had never been heard of before. Among those who heard was Mrs. Wilson, who received the information directly from a servant of Lady Rebecca's household, even in the form of a letter sent straight from Appletown. From the servant, the news should have gone to Rebecca herself. But for Mrs. Wilson, this was no simple matter. The boy's name was Richard, and he was 7 years old. She instantly guessed it truly was Richard. But that name, it was the very name Rebecca had wanted for her child before his birth. Mrs. Wilson herself had told Sister Lisa that the baby's name was Richard back then. Could the young master truly have already reached the realm of Etherwill? At the time, I did feel he had gathered a lot of ether, but this is far too fast, she thought. How will Madame react if she hears this? Even if she never cared about her son's fate, she could hardly forget his name and age. Mrs. Wilson grew restless. It would be dangerous to hide such a thing from Rebecca. She would eventually hear of it anyway. After much hesitation, Mrs. Wilson decided to tell her. She walked to a door on the 2nd floor of the Grand Castle. Knock. Knock. Madam, it's me, she called. Enter. I'm not busy. A cold voice echoed from within. Mrs. Wilson pushed the door open. A black-haired woman in a black gown sat by the window, sipping tea. She looked as though she were in her mid-20s, yet carried a mature aura. Her expression was more than indifferent. She seemed utterly detached from life itself, as though she would remain unmoved even if the world collapsed. Her eyes were cold and filled with a clear ambition. All of it matched perfectly with her pale, beautiful face. What is it, Mrs. Wilson? Rebecca asked. Madam, I have just received information from Appletown about a new genius and about someone suspected of killing your cat, Mrs. Wilson replied, taking out the letter and handing it to Rebecca so she could read it herself. Rebecca accepted the letter and began reading. In no time, Her brows knitted together. Just that reaction alone was enough to make Mrs. Wilson's heart pound. But in the end, Rebecca's response went no further. Send people to find Olivia Skylight. And that genius, I think he's a great talent. Even if he's training a codex that absorbs Tier 1 ether, his talent is still very, very high. If his identity is found, recruit him. Give him any offer until he agrees. If necessary, tell him he can marry my daughter. I will train him and make him start all over again with a better codex, she said. At that, Mrs. Wilson swallowed hard, wondering whether this woman had no suspicion at all that it was her own son. But on reflection, she realized Rebecca didn't even know which orphanage her child had been sent to. And now she wanted to recruit him, going so far as to marry him to her daughter. That daughter was not her real child, but her adopted one, the rising star of Night Valley City. She was also 7 years old, yet even with all the Moonshadow family's resources, she was still far from the realm of ether will. At present, she had only gathered about 500 ether, still a long way off. After a long silence, Mrs. Wilson nodded. She turned around and took a step while wondering what if Rebecca knew that Richard was training a codex that absorbed Tier 3 ether. Call Grace here, Rebecca added as Mrs. Wilson reached the door. The latter nodded again. Not long after, a black-haired girl who resembled Rebecca in style appeared at the doorway. Even at her young age, her extraordinary beauty was evident, and her cold demeanor was strikingly similar to Rebecca's. The only difference was her hair, perfectly straight, her bangs falling neatly to cover her forehead. And her blood-red eyes sometimes gave the impression that she wasn't entirely human. Mother. The young girl, Grace, greeted Rebecca respectfully. Rebecca had always wanted to raise her own child, but it was clear she lacked the talent for it. Between her and Grace, things were stiff and distant. Even if Grace had been her biological daughter, perhaps it would have been the same. I want to tell you that there is a boy your age who has already reached the realm of Etherwell. Even if he relied on something or stumbled upon a stroke of luck, it doesn't change the fact that his achievement surpasses yours, Rebecca said, bringing up Richard. Grace was slightly startled at her words, but since she was used to wearing a cold expression, her surprise lasted only a moment and was barely visible. I intend to recruit that boy too. My side once we discover his identity. And afterward, you will be engaged to him, Rebecca continued. Though only 7, Grace had received the finest education. Her insight was higher than that of most adults. She understood what the future demanded, that during her childhood, she must work tirelessly so that, once grown, she could secure a good life. Knowing she was merely Rebecca's adopted daughter pushed her to work even harder. Even so, she found it difficult to stay calm when her marriage was being arranged now, with someone she had only just heard of and had never met. Unfortunately, she had long been conditioned never to defy Rebecca's orders. Without realizing it, she nodded. I am forcing you, yes? But if you truly have the ability, you can refuse, Rebecca added, giving Grace a path to determine her own fate. But it was a path she could only walk with her own strength. You may go, Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. Grace left, burdened with countless thoughts. Rebecca watched her go, the faintest smile curving her lips. If you cannot be the best, then you must help me bring the best to my side, she murmured softly. She wanted a really strong adopted daughter. Grace was the best he could find. If only she found Richard, she would naturally choose him as her adopted son. As she was alone and started reading the information in the letter again, she suddenly showed a doubtful expression. Richard, 7 years. She said in a quieter voice, finally remembering the baby she had given birth to. Hasn't it been 7 years since then? When she thought about it, she couldn't help but have the strange thought that this boy might be her son, but a moment later she shook her head. What a stupid thing to think, she said to a quiet laugh, which was unusual considering she almost never laughed. Richard hurried back to Purple Rose Village with Athena. He wasn't troubled by what he had done in Appletown, but in truth, he worried that Sister Lisa, or his ancestor, might be concerned because he had been gone too long. After all, he hadn't told his ancestor about this. Surely the old man must be wondering why he hadn't shown up in days. At noon, the journey was easier for Athena. Her pace was faster than at night, and the upward paths didn't tire her at all. As they passed through other villages, Richard finally noticed how much more prosperous they were than Purple Rose Village, especially Red Wheat Village. Around each village stretched vast fields of wheat, glowing crimson, their quality far superior to ordinary grain. Richard had to slow Athena because the roads were crowded with children playing. Many of them were his age, but perhaps because their lives were comfortable, with parents and families, they seemed far more childish than the orphans. Richard couldn't be bothered to watch them. He rode past, gaze wandering over the scenery. The children, meanwhile, stared at him in awe, a boy so small, yet riding such a massive horse. Old Joe. To Richard's surprise, someone suddenly called out to Mr. Joe. It was an elderly man, tall, but extremely fat, wearing a robe that looked far too luxurious for a villager, more befitting a noble. "What is it, old bear?" Mr. Joe asked, his expression showing clear displeasure. Richard didn't know if that was truly his name, but it suited him well enough, tall, fat, like a bear. "Old Joe, I didn't expect you to still hold a grudge against me for losing at gambling," Old Bear replied, which only made Joe's face darker. "I only wanted to tell you, this morning, a flock of birds descended from the mountain, as if migrating en masse. 10 years ago, the same thing happened, and 2 days later a horde of terrifying beasts appeared around your village. You and your people should evacuate quickly." "What?" Joe's eyes went wide. "That's impossible. Old Bear, don't joke about something so serious. Don't accuse me of lying." "Do you think I would lie about this?" The fat old man looked deadly serious, enough that Richard furrowed his brows. Before Joe could say more, Richard tugged Athena's reins, urging her forward. "Old man, what kind of beasts appeared 10 years ago?" Richard asked. "Similar to the beasts in the dark forest, some even worse." Fortunately, Lisa was still a member of the Sky Armor Legion back then. She sensed something was wrong, so she called her comrades in time. Otherwise, the entire village might have been slaughtered. Joe answered breathlessly, panic creeping into his voice. "Do you know what caused their appearance?" Richard pressed. Beasts weren't unheard of near Purple Rose Village and its neighbors. At night, their howls could sometimes be heard. But overall, these mountains were considered safe. Most beasts here were only Tier 1, rarely Tier 1+, and often hunted by adventurers, making them even scarcer. The mountains themselves were protected by the kingdom, as they produced valuable crops. There had never been a large-scale beast horde. Surely something unusual had triggered this. I don't know the cause." "Perhaps Lisa does," Joe muttered, staring ahead. Richard stopped asking. This old man knew nothing. He was merely a witness to past events. From Red Wheat Village, it wasn't long before they arrived at Purple Rose Village. Old Bear hadn't been lying. The villagers were clearly restless. Everyone stood outside their homes, though the children still played, ignorant of how terrifying even one beast could be, let alone a horde. "Get down here." Richard ordered Joe to dismount. After that, he went straight to the orphanage. The children inside were carrying on with their usual activities. Richard asked where Sister Lisa was, and they said she was inside. When Richard stepped in, he found Sister Lisa herself, her face clouded with worry. The woman was startled to see him, but then looked relieved. "Richard, thank goodness you're here. Quick, help me write a letter," she said hurriedly, clearly not in the mood to ask why he had only just returned after several days. "Sister, is it true that a beast horde is coming?" Richard asked in response. "So you've already heard?" "Yes, it's true. There may be a beast horde. 10 years ago, they appeared 2 days after the birds left," Sister Lisa answered. She scratched her hair anxiously while searching for paper and ink. "Where do they come from? What causes them to appear? Isn't this region supposed to be safe?" Richard pressed for answers. "I don't know. Our investigation 10 years ago yielded nothing. The beast horde seemed to just appear out of nowhere." Hearing that, Richard furrowed his brows again. So even Sister Lisa and her comrades in the Sky Armor Legion didn't know. At that moment, Sister Lisa finally found paper and ink. She handed them to Richard. Quick, write this. Brother Carlos, Purple Rose Village may be attacked by a beast horde again. Please inform the commander about this. Richard reluctantly took the materials and went to the table to write down exactly what Sister Lisa said. Though he had never studied writing in this world, he had memorized the shapes of every letter. He could write naturally, though his hand was stiff and the result not very pretty. Anyone reading it might be annoyed at the sloppy handwriting. But to Sister Lisa, who couldn't read, it was already extraordinary. She quickly took the paper and hurried off, clearly intending to send it with a pigeon. Left alone, Richard fell into thought but couldn't figure out anything. Finally, he left the orphanage and rode his horse into the forest to meet his ancestor, whom he hadn't visited in quite some time. Richard sometimes worried the old man might vanish if he didn't come see him. Fortunately, the man was still there, lounging in a freshly made chair. He was eating roasted duck and drinking wine from who knows where. "Oh, Richard, you're finally back." The man immediately sat up when he saw him. "Grandfather, are you all right?" Richard asked. The question made Aldrich laugh. "Boy, are you worried about me? Come now, you know your ancestor once competed for the world magic ether, and I'm still alive after sleeping for so long in the Sea of Calamity. What could possibly threaten me in a forest like this?" "Oh, you seem to have formed an ether will. Did your trip outside grant you much benefit?" His eyes narrowed as he sensed the difference in Richard. "Grandfather, you knew I went outside?" Richard asked. "Of course I knew. I sneaked into your village when you didn't show up for days and heard that you had gone to a town," Aldrich replied. Richard nodded. "Yes, I did gain much from it. By the way, Grandfather, the birds left the mountain. I heard that 10 years ago, when this happened, a beast horde suddenly appeared around the village. It seems it will happen again. In your opinion, what causes it?" "Just a small matter," Aldrich said, confusing Richard. "You see, if the sky falls, let the great ones handle it. If it's a small problem, leave it to the small folk. This is only a minor matter, you don't need to worry too much. Didn't they deal with the horde 10 years ago? This time, they should be able to handle it again." Richard. "Grandfather, you seem to enjoy making jokes," Richard said, his expression torn between a smile and a grimace. But Aldrich beckoned him over to the chair. "Sit. Let's talk about your training. You've improved a lot. Have you mastered the Codex of Moonshadow and the 2 arcanes I gave you?" "I've begun to master them," Richard replied. "How much?" Aldrich pressed. "Among them, my progress with 100 shadow monsters has been the fastest." As he said this, Richard waved his hand. Whoosh! He released shadow energy that instantly formed into 8 massive shadow lions, 5 times larger than normal lions. Compared to last time, they were far bigger because Richard's ether had doubled. Aldrich's eyes widened at the sight. For him, this was unimaginable. But to Richard, it was nothing special. "Grandfather, as you can see, I've made great progress. Now, will you tell me how those beasts appear?" Richard asked again. "I already told you, it's just a small matter. You don't need to trouble yourself over small matters," Aldrich replied again, making Richard roll his eyes. The problem was, Aldrich truly saw it as a trivial issue, not worth attention. It wasn't that he was hiding anything, he simply didn't care. Richard fell silent for a while, then remembered something. "Grandfather, what do you think about the Black Heart Soul?" "That is something remarkable. Dragon Knights rely on it to become unstoppable, for it gives the heart the ability to gather hidden power. If I had it, I could grow even stronger." Aldrich said at once, serious this time. "But the Black Heart Soul demands too much slaughter. Without killing, one cannot charge the heart with power. Even its assistance in training is not that great without slaughter. Still, who would object to slaughter if it meant greater strength? Unfortunately, it said only one book records the method of creating a Black Heart Soul, and its whereabouts are now unknown." Aldrich looked at Richard curiously. "Where did you hear about the Black Heart Soul?" he asked. "From here," Richard replied, showing him the black book. Aldrich snatched it immediately, though Richard didn't mind, he had already memorized the method. Aldrich quickly opened it, eyes widening in shock, his mouth slightly agape. Where did you find this?" he asked, breath quickening. From an acquaintance whose name and features I won't mention, Richard replied calmly, making Aldrich the one to roll his eyes this time. Boy, you dare keep secrets from your ancestor, Aldrich said, annoyed but clearly joking. He read the black book again, frowning from time to time. The method is truly simple, but this ritual. He murmured, his expression growing grave. Is something wrong with the ritual, grandfather? Richard asked. It's not a serious problem, but I'm concerned. This ritual is extremely painful, involving wicked souls. It could be enough to make even a good-natured person turn hot-tempered, Aldrich replied. Oh. Richard showed an uncertain expression upon hearing that. Personality changes might be natural, but only when they came after various experiences. Richard couldn't say he was willing for his personality to suddenly become short-tempered. In the end, the black heart soul wants a person to become a butcher in order to gain power. Although slaughter itself isn't necessarily a grave problem, if it happens because we can't control ourselves, are we still truly ourselves? Aldrich chuckled as he went on, while Richard felt he was right. This is something I avoided, Aldrich added, tossing the book aside. Then, he fixed his gaze seriously on Richard. Richard, your soul is undoubtedly extraordinary. While you could make it more versatile by having 2 different types and thus enhance your talent further, I advise you to choose another soul type, not the black heart soul. Richard furrowed his brows at that, then asked, is there a way to overcome its side effects? Yes, of course there is. The sacred flame, fire that does not burn hot, but can consume all forms of evil. With it, one could easily purge any unwanted evil side from oneself. However, to fuse with the sacred flame requires a 90% affinity with the fire element. Grandfather, where can I find the sacred flame? Richard asked immediately. For him, the requirement was almost too easy. His very first elemental affinity was fire. It was also the first to reach 90%. Richard's quick response surprised Aldrich. Boy, don't tell me you have a 90% fire affinity, he asked, clearly scolding him for jumping straight to where it could be found. In answer, Richard released an ether, shaping it into a fist-sized fireball. This one had no violet streaks anymore, it was pure flame. Most astonishing was its brilliance. Even under the bright midday sun, the fire's glow stood out strikingly. Richard himself felt no heat from it, but Aldrich could. The heat was evident in the way nearby leaves began to dry and curl. My affinity with fire is indeed 90%, Richard said casually. Aldrich's mouth hung open, struggling for words. Of course, he had never known exactly what Richard's elemental affinities were. Usually, even those with great talent didn't start with 90% affinity. Only a rare few were born that way. Most people had to train diligently to raise it. Since Richard was his descendant, and seemed to have inherited his clan's gifts, Aldrich assumed his talents lay only in darkness, shadow, and lightning. And even then, he never imagined Richard had a 90% affinity with any of them. Yet here he was, with fire at 90%. Wait, boy, the fire spirit queen has the sacred flame. I'll take it from her body, Aldrich said, standing abruptly before striding toward the unconscious red-haired old woman. Oh. Richard grew curious, recalling how his ancestor once said the fire spirit queen's body was an extraordinary treasure. Was it because she possessed the sacred flame? But he still wondered, how could something be taken from another person's body? At that moment, Aldrich forced the fire spirit queen upright, though she remained unconscious. With her body tied to the tree all the way up to her head, the old woman was made to stand. Then Aldrich pried her mouth open and sent his ether inside. Ag. Suddenly, her slack mouth let out a raspy cry. Richard then saw a white light shine forth. Ha, so easy. Truly, without strength, anyone becomes helpless, Aldrich laughed heartily. Right after, Richard saw a serene white flame emerge from the fire spirit queen's mouth. It floated gently, settling into Aldrich's palm. Richard, the sacred flame is something born of nature, a fire that never dies. It's an external power and can also be considered an artifact. Although fusing with it is extremely difficult, its uses are many. People sometimes use it to purge poison or to eradicate all kinds of evil power. It can even be merged into weapons of justice. Once it has fused with you, it can still be taken by others, just as I did now. That's why you must guard it well, never let it be stolen, Aldrich said. Then he tossed the white flame toward Richard, and it floated slowly like a drifting balloon. Swallow it, he added. Richard didn't wait for it to reach him. He opened his mouth and inhaled sharply, sucking the flame in. It wasn't his power that did it, but it wasn't hot at all. Instead, it filled him with comfort as it entered his mouth. Though it had just come from the mouth of an old, now ugly-looking woman, he didn't hesitate to swallow it. Gulp. He felt it fall into his stomach, then begin merging with every cell of his body, filling him with a mysterious sensation. Ding! You have fused with the sacred flame, fire that can burn away all evil. External power. Sacred flame. As Richard bonded with it, he realized he could transform his fire element into sacred flame or merge it with his own fire. He released some ether onto his palm, immediately converting it into sacred flame. In an instant, a calm white fire appeared above his hand. Not fire for destruction, but for support, Richard thought. How do you feel, boy? Aldrich asked, approaching him. Incredible. Grandfather, does that old woman still have things like this inside her? Richard asked in return. Don't think there are many like it. This woman has various other flames in her body since she's the fire spirit queen. Some come from her bloodline, some are fires she cultivated herself. But they're not things you can just swallow like the sacred flame, Aldrich explained. Richard smiled wryly because he was indeed too hopeful. Of course, I wouldn't say there are no other useful things from her body for you. After all, in the previous era, she was the strongest in terms of fire power. But for now you are still too weak for stronger things. Not everything you can get just with an elemental affinity that reaches 90%, Aldrich said again. Grandfather, can I perform the ritual to obtain the Black Heart Soul now? Richard asked. Yes, you can, you truly can. It might not even be painful for you, since the pain it brings comes from evil influence, not physical assault, Aldrich replied. But, do you have the required materials? He then asked. The necessary ingredients were both easy and difficult to find, for they consisted of human parts. The very first was the blood of a virgin woman. In this world, there was no such thing as blood donors. One could not expect to obtain blood without hurting someone. Aside from blood, a brain was also required, specifically, the brain of someone with a strongly evil nature. Then, 10 pairs of different eyes. All of these were needed to summon wicked souls. They were special, not ordinary evil souls. And even with those materials, one could not summon them without having at least 90% dark element affinity. You don't need to worry about the virgin's blood. We can take it from the fire spirit queen, Aldrich said when Richard fell silent. Richard's eyes widened at that, staring at his ancestor with a twitching face. Is she still a virgin? Richard asked, struggling to even say the words. Yeah, of course. In this world, many powerful women are too busy practice from a young age. They have no time for marriage or even dating. Aldrich chuckled as he explained. In that case, I only need to find the brain of someone with an evil nature and 10 pairs of eyes, Richard said. That was something that required him to act ruthlessly. Of course, he didn't have to target ordinary people, since this world was not lacking in criminals. At times, such things were indeed necessary, not just for soul rituals, but often to help increase elemental affinity. For example, someone who wanted to raise their affinity with the wind element could use the body of another who had the same affinity as a material. The methods varied, turning them into potions, concoctions, or other means. Though it seemed cruel, few would hesitate when it came to gaining power. Grandfather, was there anything else that drifted down the river? Richard asked. He was a little curious about what had happened while he was away. Unfortunately, nothing useful, Aldrich replied. Were they useless? Yes, but that doesn't mean worthless. Most of them were fragments of weapons and such, all made of high-quality materials. Oh, could you give me one to sell? I need money. Richard knew those fragments could be recycled, but he lacked the knowledge to do so. Naturally, if they were high quality, their price would be high as well. Take this. Aldrich casually handed him something from his pocket. Richard found it was a sword hilt, Made of wood that seemed stronger than most iron yet still as light as ordinary wood, has a long dragon carving. That's Obsidora wood. Don't sell it for mortal coin. You must sell it for nature spirits, Aldrich instructed. Nature spirits were the currency of magi, known for being able to rapidly restore their spent ether, among many other uses. Richard nodded and stored the sword hilt away. Grandfather, I also have a bloodline potion. Do you think it would be suitable to give it to my horse? Richard pulled out the red liquid-filled vial he had obtained from Olivia. It's worth a try. The result might be good, Aldrich answered. Richard then looked at Athena, gesturing for her to approach. The horse obediently came closer, looking at him with curious eyes. This drink can help you evolve, so try drinking it, Richard told Athena as he opened the bottle. Athena, obedient as ever, nodded her head to Richard, opened her mouth, and allowed him to pour the potion inside, swallowing it without hesitation. Afterward, Richard stepped back, curious to see what would happen. Buzz. The horse's body shone with a red light, glowing even in her eyes. Richard saw her muscles grow tauter, while her skin darkened with a faint red tint. Yet the horse remained calm, not even restless, as though nothing unusual had occurred. The red light suddenly condensed into radiant wings upon her back, fluttering gently, though not lifting the horse into the air. Not bad, the primordial bloodline of this horse has awakened. It has evolved into a primordial beast, now at Tier 1+. Richard, if you wanted to continue evolving, you must feed it grass mixed with nature spirits. If it reaches Tier 11, it will gain true wings and be able to carry you through the skies. Aldrich explained. That's too far off, Richard replied. Tier 1, 1+, and so forth were still considered mortal ranks. Tier 10 was the equivalent of a magus in the ethereal realm. For magi, there was only the ethereal realm, but within it, their strength varied based on both the quantity and quality of their ether. Their power could be gauged as equivalent to what tier of primordial beasts they compared to, or also to sky armor knights. As for wild beasts, though they were divided into similar tiers, they usually peaked at Tier 5 unless they evolved into primordial beasts. But grandfather, since this horse can release wings of light now, can't it be used for flying? Richard asked. Of course not. At most, it can only slow its descent when falling from high places, Aldrich replied. I see. Richard nodded. In that case, grandfather, I'll be going now, Richard said. Yes, make sure to surprise me again when you return. Ha ha ha, that's a promise. Richard chuckled. He mounted Athena, but had her retract her wings of light before galloping away. I'll train first, he thought, not rushing to gather the materials for the Black Heart Soul, since he had only just returned to the village, and for now there was an unknown crisis, though it should only be a small matter, to be resolved once the Sky Armor Knights arrived. Not wanting to waste time, he planned to spend the rest of the day in training. Ding! Your affinity with the wave element has increased from 79% to 85%. Wave, 85%. Richard suddenly received a notification from the system, but only his elemental affinity had risen. When Richard returned to the village, he found more commotion caused by the panic of the villagers, with Lisa trying her best to calm them down. Many of them actually refused to evacuate, as it would not be easy for them. The reason was that they were not as wealthy as Mr. Joe. Most of them had no savings and lived by relying on the natural resources of the village. If they were forced to evacuate, they feared they would have nothing to eat and nowhere to sleep. Fortunately, once they were informed that the Sky Armor Legion would be sending their knights, the villagers finally began to calm down. Richard was too lazy to approach the villagers. Instead, he entered the orphanage, went to his room, locked the door, and sat down to absorb ether. Perhaps later, if a horde of beasts truly came, he would just roar at them. Unlike Apple Town, the amount of ether in this village was indeed lower, but not by a great margin. With his current ability, Richard could still absorb one ether in less than 30 minutes. Now, he realized he could not completely rely on the system if he wanted to advance faster, since the amount of ether he needed to gather was overwhelming. By evening, he had managed to gather 17 ether, plus 17 more from his ether bottle, making it 34 in total. Ether, 34/10, 000, Tier 3, plus 34. Ether accumulation, 2034, Tier 3. Richard smiled in satisfaction at the result, though he did not feel much stronger, since 34 compared to 2000 was barely a 1% increase. Time for a bath, he thought as he stood up. His body felt dusty now. In this state, he would not be able to train comfortably later tonight. Just as he stood, he felt faint vibrations and the sound of many horses' hooves. He quickly went to the window and spotted a group of white horses, ridden by knights in gleaming white armor. There were around 20 of them, led by Carlos, the same one who had come 2 years ago. Richard had not expected them to arrive so quickly, barely half a day since Sister Lisa had sent the message. Although they had not yet entered the village, Richard could see Sister Lisa and the villagers already there to welcome them. What caught his eye, however, was August. He had grown taller, though still a child. He was already wearing sky armor, mounted on his own horse. And he wasn't the only child among them. There were 2 others, 1 boy and 1 red-haired girl. Among the 3, the girl seemed to hold the highest status, as she rode in the center while the others flanked her sides. Her eyes shone with curiosity as she looked at the village, as if it were a whole new world to her. She spoke with August, probably asking him about his past life here. Though only 2 years had passed, August clearly had not forgotten his village, and his temperament had not changed much. Yet, he already bore the gaze of a child raised in the city. More importantly, he looked sharper now. Richard knew he could no longer trick August so easily in a fight, not like when they had both been ordinary boys. After observing them for a while, Richard went to bathe, then dressed in fresh, comfortable clothes to await the night. Unexpectedly, August actually entered the orphanage with the red-haired girl and the other boy. "Look, Emma, this is where I used to live," August said enthusiastically. Emma must have been the one curious to see August's former home. Her bright eyes scanned the orphanage, then moved toward Richard. When they landed on him, her gaze lingered, trailing over him from head to toe, as he looked completely different from the other children. August's brows knitted slightly when he noticed Emma's gaze fixed on Richard. "Who is he, August?" Emma asked. He's my friend, Richard." August explained softly, but Richard's sharp hearing picked up every word. "Richard? Did he fail to control the sky armor?" Emma seemed too curious about him. "Yes, he failed. I was the only one who succeeded back then," August quickly answered. Richard almost laughed. It was so obvious. August wanted to gain Emma's attention and panicked the moment she showed interest in another boy. On the other side, the other boy's expression soured, clearly displeased at how much August spoke with the girl. "Emma, let's go somewhere else." "There's still much of the village to see," August said again. When she learned Richard had failed to control the sky armor, the girl seemed to lose interest. She simply nodded at August. As they left, August didn't even spare Richard a glance. "He's no longer afraid of me, nor does he bow down to me," Richard thought with a chuckle. Of course, he had no problem with that, as long as August did not become his enemy. If he did, Richard would simply show him who the real boss was. With the arrival of the knights, the village finally regained complete peace. The Sky Knights began investigating the surrounding area. Yet, they found no signs of beasts anywhere. What was happening remained unclear. After dinner, Richard once again secluded himself in his room, absorbing ether. From time to time, he tried practicing his 2 codices and arcane art on his own, but they were still too difficult, so he gave up. He absorbed ether until midnight, gathering 19, plus 19 more from his ether bottle, making a total of 38. Ether, 72/10, 000, Tier 3, plus 38. Ether accumulation, 2072, Tier 3. His eyes could no longer stay open, and he soon fell asleep, awaiting the next day. In the morning, Richard woke up a little late. Talk, talk, talk. He was roused by the knocking on his door. Who could it be, he wondered, thinking it couldn't be Sister Lisa, who usually just called his name. Curious, he opened the door, only to be stunned. August. He was the one knocking, leaning casually against the doorway. Naturally, Richard had thought he might run into him sooner or later, but not this quickly. Was it because of Emma? "Richard, can you help me?" he asked, surprising Richard even more. He was actually asking for help. But even while asking, the way he spoke to Richard was different now. No longer like a subordinate to a superior. "What do you want me to do?" Richard asked curiously, his eyes falling on the boy clad head to toe in armor. August looked slightly taller, likely because of the high boots that were part of his sky armor. "You know that red-haired girl. She's the commander's daughter," August said, slightly surprising Richard. The commander was the leader of the Sky Armor Legion in a province, a truly formidable figure. In this province, the 8-star province, he was without doubt one of the most powerful individuals. The governor might outrank him in position, but that did not mean he was stronger or more influential. If compared to Earth, he would be the equivalent of a 2-star general. Of course, in this world, everything was determined by individual combat strength. One could not obtain a position, let alone a military one, without the power to back it up. It could be said that such a figure would fear no one in the province, except perhaps the Moonshadow clan, who happened to reside here. That clan had declined, once famed for an ancestor even stronger than the kingdom itself. Yet now, with Lady Rebecca, the clan once again bared its fangs. Regardless, the truth remained that even though Emma was just a little girl, if she went to Appletown, the city's lord would personally welcome her. Richard, of course, was very surprised she had come to this village. "What about her?" Richard asked, narrowing his eyes at August. "I hope that in the future I'll become her husband. That way I can receive better training," August replied. But Richard was not surprised at his thought. Living in a smarter environment, August had clearly begun to understand how the world worked, knowing what he needed to do to climb higher. Of course, even if his talent was remarkable enough to let him associate with the commander's daughter, his ambition was still far too lofty given his background as an orphan from a remote village. Richard held back from mocking him, instead becoming more interested in what he was planning. "What can I help you with?" Richard asked. "Of course, help me make her fall in love with me. If you succeed, I'll definitely help you in the future. I understand what you want. But what's the plan?" "That's why I came to you. I want you to help me think of one. After all, you're smarter than most kids." Richard. At first, he thought the boy had come with some elaborate plan that required him to play a role. But no, he came because he wanted Richard to come up with the plan for him. "I don't have any skill in that. Go ask someone else," Richard replied bluntly, not bothering to play along. "But you're the only one I can ask. You're the only one I can rely on," August said. Of course, he didn't look like he was begging. It was only his words. His expression was already starting to look forceful. "If it were that easy, I'd just make her fall in love with me instead," Richard answered. "You," August's eyes widened instantly. "August, it seems you need to be reminded who the boss is." Richard didn't wait for him to show his anger. He grabbed the boy's armored collar, dragged him into the room, and shoved him down. And Richard couldn't help but be surprised by how heavy the armor August wore was. If his movement hadn't been sudden, he doubted August would have fallen at all. Has he already reached Tier 2? Richard thought, finding it hard to believe. Although training with the sky armor indeed accelerated growth, this kind of speed meant August's talent was extremely high. "Richard, how dare you? You think this is the same as before?" August finally shouted. But before he could stand, Richard raised his hand. Whoosh! Something invisible struck him, his eyes and mouth opening wide. He shuddered, and moments later blood trickled from his nose and mouth. Richard had attacked with Wave, one of the elements he was attuned to. Though it sounded ordinary, Wave was terrifying precisely because it was invisible. Richard could even send his waves through matter, through August's sky armor, through his flesh and skin, striking directly at his cells. He could even carry other elements along with the waves. If he had used any other attack, defeating a sky armor knight would not have been so easy, since the armor granted such powerful defense. Of course, he had gone easy. Otherwise, August would have died without even knowing how. All he did was shake his organs. Cough. Cough. August hacked violently, staring at Richard in horror. 2 years in the Sky Armor Legion had made him familiar with magic, as he often trained alongside magi. Without any need for explanation, he immediately realized Richard had just used magic. His perception, sharpened by wearing the sky armor, let him feel the magical energy when Richard unleashed it. Yet he could not understand what kind of magic it was. He only thought it far too terrifying, crippling him instantly before he could even fight back. This had never happened. Since attaining Tier 2 sky armor, he had been able to spar with lower-class ether will magi on even footing for a time before losing. "Get out, now," Richard said coldly. August forced himself to stand, nodding repeatedly before stumbling out awkwardly. The fear of Richard, which had only just faded, returned in full. Ding! Your affinity with the wave element has increased from 85% to 90%. Your mastery of the Codex of Moonshadow has increased from 4% to 6%. Wave, 90%. Codex. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 30%. Codex of Moonshadow, 6%. So fast, even an extra point. Richard was stunned by the sudden notification. Not long after August left, Sister Lisa suddenly arrived. "Richard, are you the 7-year-old boy who shocked Apple Town?" the woman asked with great excitement. From the look on her face, she had just received the news and was now absolutely certain it was him. "Yes, that's me." Richard saw no need to hide it, since she was already so sure. Whether it was her or Mrs. Wilson, both already knew he had been training. When she heard it, Sister Lisa drew a deep breath, her eyes gazing at him as if wondering if he was the same baby she had once taken in from his aunt. Only 7 years since that day, how could he already have reached this point? "Sister Lisa, I hope you'll keep it a secret." "This could cause me trouble," Richard said. Of course. Sister Lisa nodded quickly. Richard didn't eat breakfast or take a bath. He walked straight out of the orphanage to see the situation. The Sky Armor Knights were still roaming around on their horses, searching for the reason the birds had fled the mountain. So far, their investigation seemed to have yielded no results. Sniff. Sniff. Suddenly, Richard heard the sound of a horse, as if calling out to him. It even raised both front legs when it saw him. Richard quickly approached. "What is it?" he asked while stroking its head. The horse responded as if urging him toward a place in the forest, though in a different direction from his ancestors' location. Curious, Richard nodded, mounted its back, and let Athena take him where she wished to go. Richard strongly suspected his horse had sensed something. After all, she had become a primordial beast. Matters related to beasts were likely things she could sense more quickly than others. Not only did she feel the threat, she also knew the location of that threat. Richard. As Richard set out, he heard August's voice and saw him riding up from behind, already looking recovered even though his nose and mouth had been bleeding earlier. Perhaps he had relied on something to recover faster. "Where are you going?" August asked when his horse came up beside Athena. His tone once again resembled that of a subordinate, like the old days when he always followed Richard wherever he went. Of course, now it was likely because he was curious about Richard's strength. "You'll see," Richard answered, too lazy to explain further since there really wasn't much he could explain. Athena walked at a slow pace into the forest, whose trees were thick and tangled with countless vines hanging from tree to tree, blocking the path. Yet Athena was a clever horse, always able to find a way through, so Richard didn't have to do anything. "Have we ever been here before?" August wondered aloud as he looked around. Richard didn't respond. By his own memory, he had never been here. Athena carried him deeper and deeper, where the forest grew so dense that sunlight barely penetrated below. Though it was still morning and the sun was bright, here in the forest it felt like twilight beneath storm clouds. August began to look uneasy, visibly unsettled by such a silent area. Elsewhere there would be the sounds of insects, but here, everything was silent. He could only hear his own breathing and the hooves of the horses. Soon, Richard spotted a cave, entirely green with vines that covered it. It was massive, even taller than the surrounding trees. Inside, It looked bright, apparently. The cave's ceiling had many openings where light streamed in. How can there be a cave here? August muttered, while Richard signaled Athena to keep moving forward. He couldn't just look at the cave. He had to go inside. At the entrance, he had to push away several vines before they could enter. Though hesitant, August still followed when Richard went in. What they found inside left them both stunned. The cave was so vast that Richard thought it was larger than 2 football fields. The shocking part was that it held thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of massive eggs, each about as tall as a 7-year-old boy like him. Some of the eggs were already cracked, as if ready to hatch at any moment, and Richard could feel the aura of beasts emanating from those broken shells. Beasts that hatched from eggs, serpents, crocodiles, lizards, all sorts of reptiles, would consume their shells upon birth, gaining high-level nutrients. That would allow them to grow strong enough to instantly become Tier 1 or Tier 1 plus beasts. So this is what you felt, Richard said to Athena, who gave a light nod. But who had placed so many beast eggs in this cave? Richard wondered. What? August suddenly seemed shocked by something else. Richard turned to him with a confused look, seeing nothing else surprising. Richard, the knights are returning to the fortress, August said, causing Richard to furrow his brows. Sky armor users could transmit messages to each other, so long as they weren't too far apart. It seemed August had just received such a message. Why would they return to the fortress? Richard asked. The problem hadn't been solved, yet they were withdrawing. Richard felt a scheme at work. I don't know, maybe an order from above. They said everything is fine, August answered. You know everything is not fine, Richard replied. August's eyes trembled. Someone must be planning to slaughter Purple Rose Village with these beasts, he said. Yes, and someone influential enough to make the knights withdraw, Richard replied. He wondered who it might be. Many magi committed massacres of common folk as part of their training. Of course, the person didn't have to be overwhelmingly strong. But they might very well have a strong background. Richard, let's just destroy the eggs, August said. At least you know what must be done, Richard answered. There was indeed a sinister scheme, but if these eggs were destroyed, could that scheme still proceed? You wait outside. I can handle this alone, he added. Richard, there are too many of them. I can help you, August protested, unwilling to leave. I don't want my attack to accidentally kill you, Richard replied, sending a wave into August's body without causing harm. Of course, August immediately felt the threatening force inside his body, paling as he realized it truly could kill him. Go, Richard ordered sharply. August quickly commanded his horse to leave. Richard directed Athena to move deeper into the cave. Now, the beasts were still weak inside their eggs. Killing them would be as easy as killing ants for him. The only problem was the sheer number of ants he had to kill. Luckily, he possessed wave attacks that could reach farther than fire. Richard closed his eyes, spreading his waves, sharper and more dangerous than before. They could even be used for cutting. Clop, clop, clop. Faint popping sounds echoed from egg after egg as Richard's waves passed through them. What he did was nothing more than shattering the hearts of the beast infants within. As they died, the eggs cracked open, but only lifeless bodies spilled out. Richard smiled at the result, though he couldn't reach all of them in one go. Afterward, he moved dozens of meters forward before repeating the action. Clop, clop, clop. The popping sounds echoed again, hundreds, then thousands of times. Richard didn't spend much ether to kill all the beast infants inside their eggs. From outside, August couldn't believe what he was seeing. Richard, whom he had thought would only ever be a star in a remote village, suddenly wielding such overwhelming power. Up to this point, Richard hadn't even gotten off his horse. But to his surprise, Athena began eating the eggshells. Apparently, their nutrients were useful even for a primordial beast like her. Richard didn't stop her since Athena wanted to eat, but he couldn't wait around. He dismounted. Return on your own later, he told her. Athena nodded lightly and Richard went over to August. I'll ride with you, he said before climbing onto August's horse. Richard, why is your horse eating? August asked curiously, but Richard couldn't be bothered to respond. Pwah, pwah, pwah. Receiving no answer, August gave up and urged his horse back toward the village. When they returned, Richard saw the knights had already gathered in front of the orphanage. They seemed ready to leave, but the villagers were protesting. The knights, however, simply insisted that everything was fine. August's arrival caused the debate to pause for a moment. "Where have you been? Why did you take so long?" one knight scolded. "And then I went for a walk, and my horse wanted to eat." "I couldn't force him to stop until he was full," August replied cautiously. Richard had, of course, dismounted before leaving the forest, so he slipped away unnoticed. He strolled calmly toward the orphanage, his eyes falling on Sister Lisa, who was speaking with Carlos. "Lisa, there's nothing I can do. Orders from above command me to withdraw. I can only hope you'll be careful." "Of course, it's better if you leave quickly," Carlos said, while Sister Lisa looked anxious. Naturally, she understood how the Legion worked. If an order from above had been given, subordinates could not refuse unless they were ready to be branded rebels. "Brother Carlos, have you not discovered why the birds fled?" Lisa asked in response. "I searched the area, but I found nothing. Of course, I can't guarantee there's nothing out there. There are still many places left unexplored. The time was too short, and the forest around this village is far too vast." Carlos sighed helplessly. "You know, even though this kingdom is anti-crime, its power has been declining continuously. Some noble clans have grown aggressive, eager to strengthen themselves so they might at least play a role when the world magic ether appears," he added. "Who do you think the mastermind is?" Clearly, they would start with Purple Rose Village, then move to the others nearby. "While everyone is slaughtered, he'll watch from the side and draw in the slaughtered souls," Sister Lisa said. "It's hard to say. The Moonshadow clan is the unofficial ruler of the 8-star province, but they don't have the habit of mass slaughter for growth. While they do kill often, it's usually out of conflict," Carlos replied. Sister Lisa fell silent at that. Carlos sighed again. "I hope we meet again someday. Please be careful," he said before mounting his horse. With him leading, the knights departed at once. August occasionally turned to glance back at Richard, while Emma clearly didn't understand anything. To her, this village and its people were merely something curious. "Richard." Sister Lisa was slightly startled to see him. "Where's your horse?" She quickly noticed he hadn't returned with it. Of course, she had seen him leave on horseback. "Sister, there's no need to worry too much. Everything is fine now," Richard said casually before walking off again. Lisa was baffled by his words, unsure what Richard meant. Meanwhile, Richard walked toward his ancestor's hut. Today, the old man was fishing, sitting on a chair he had built himself. "Oh, Richard, where's your horse?" he asked as he saw Richard approaching on foot. "She's eating the eggshells I destroyed," Richard replied. "Your horse is eating them?" Aldrich looked so shocked that he rose from his chair. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Richard asked in confusion. This man knew about the eggs, but had only regarded them as a minor problem. The fact that Athena was eating them was what shocked him. Not every primordial beast can eat just anything to grow stronger. Normally, only nature's spirits or some pure resources. But those eggshells, they're coarse, suitable only for their original owners. Yet, there are primordial beasts that can consume anything and absorb its nutrients. They are the ones who carry the king bloodline. The king bloodline? Richard was somewhat surprised to hear this. Though he had never heard of it, the word king was obviously not something ordinary. "If your horse can continue to grow, there's a chance she could approach the peak level of the magical world, close to my level in my prime," Aldrich said with a chuckle. "Only close?" Richard asked. "It's not so easy to reach the peak. You should know, in this kingdom's long history, only 3 people ever reached that level. The kingdom's founder, who eventually obtained the world magic ether in his era, then one of its kings, and myself. To reach that height, a primordial beast must carry the emperor bloodline. So there's an even greater bloodline. But Grandpa, who placed those eggs there?" Richard couldn't help but bring up the matter. Even though he had destroyed them, the mastermind was still unknown. Of course, it wouldn't be easy for the mastermind to act again. After all, how easy was it to find over 10,000 beast eggs? "I found those eggs while wandering around, but I didn't see who put them there." "Aren't they destroyed already? Why dwell on it?" If I hadn't found them, this village could have been destroyed because the knights from the Sky Armor Legion suddenly withdrew, Richard said with a frown. Oh, then the culprit must be connected to the Sky Armor Legion. Aldrich chuckled, still treating the matter lightly. Richard scratched his head. Talking to him about this seemed useless. Grandpa, I'll be training here. Richard climbed up into his ancestor's hut, sat down, and began absorbing ether again. Until Athena finished, he couldn't wander far, so while she ate, he would keep cultivating. After that, he could embark on adventures to gather materials for the Black Heart Soul. If possible, he wanted the brain of the mastermind behind this massacre plot, along with a pair of his eyes. And perhaps the lackeys too, he could take their eyes as well. Of course, he was filled with hatred, knowing his village had been marked for slaughter. Ether, 110/10, Tier 3, plus 38. Ether accumulation, 2110, Tier 3. By evening, Richard had gained an additional 38 ether. When he opened his eyes, he saw his ancestor watching him. Boy, your speed in absorbing ether is remarkable. If you keep this up, you could gather everything you need within a year, Aldrich said. Richard smiled at that, but then shook his head. Even so, I still need to gather the fragments of the ether skeleton. If luck doesn't favor me, who knows whether I'll even find one, he replied. You don't need to worry so much. Someone is blessed with fortune, as you will actually find it difficult not to come across those fragments, Aldrich answered. I hope so. Richard then stood up. Grandpa, I'll return to the village now. Good, good. Tonight, you must train again. And don't just absorb ether, master the codex and the arcane arts I've given you. Of course. Richard chuckled to himself. He made his way back leisurely, walking along the path. The village had grown rather calm after the Sky Armor Knight's departure. The villagers seemed to believe everything was fine now. Richard didn't see his horse, Athena, and assumed she still needed more time to eat. If her strength grew, Richard would have little reason to worry about her. He bathed, changed his clothes, and had dinner with the orphanage children. Richard. Sister Lisa called out as he was about to return to his room. What is it, sister? Richard asked curiously. I just heard the Moonshadow clan has been inquiring about your identity. They even invited you to join them. They're offering you the chance to be betrothed to one of their girls. What do you think? Richard didn't know how to react at first. But then he quickly shook his head. I'll just stay in this village. Life was already complicated enough in Appletown. I wouldn't last in the tangled web of noble clans, he said. Sister Lisa was a little surprised by his words, but then she seemed to agree. Ha ha, true. You'll only run into endless trouble if you join a major faction. Besides, you've grown well in this village. Your achievements are something no great clan could replicate, so why bother with them, she replied. Richard suspected she might have suffered troublesome experiences during her time with the Sky Armor Legion, likely the reason she returned to manage the orphanage. Sister, I'll train for a while. Good night, Richard said before entering his room. Not long after he sat down on his bed, he received a notification from the system. Ding! Your mastery over Codex of Dragon Emperor has increased from 30% to 31%. Your mastery over Codex of Moonshadow has increased from 6% to 8%. Your mastery over Lightning of Darkness has increased from 4% to 7%. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 31%. Codex of Moonshadow, 8%. Arcane Art, 100 Shadow Monster, 8%. Lightning of Darkness, 7%. It wasn't ether, but mastery. Richard was still satisfied with the system's rewards for today. He resumed absorbing ether, slightly faster than during the afternoon. He didn't continue for long. Drowsiness overcame him. Still, he managed to absorb 17 ether, and with the added 34 from his ether bottle, his total increased. Ether, 144/10, Tier 3, plus 34. Ether accumulation, 2144, Tier 3. The next morning, Richard woke up late again, having gone to sleep too late the night before. He rose slowly and looked out the window only to see Athena grazing near the orphanage. Without hesitation, he rushed downstairs. Athena didn't look different, the same as when he had last seen her. But Richard felt the horse was concealing her true form. She had clearly evolved again, for he could sense a faint pressure emanating from her. "Did you eat all those eggshells?" Richard asked. Athena gave a light nod. Richard couldn't imagine how she managed to devour them all, given their sheer number. "Let's go." Richard wanted to wander and seek the mastermind behind his village's intended slaughter. He was certain that whoever had placed those eggs must be lurking nearby, if not in this village, then likely in another, more prosperous one. Richard suspected they might be in Red Wheat Village, a place often visited by outsiders and far better suited for townsfolk to live in. He mounted Athena, and she immediately carried him out of the village, traveling once more. Her speed was nearly double what it had been last time. It didn't take long before they arrived at the thriving Red Wheat Village. At this hour, most villagers were in their fields, but the settlement was far from quiet. Besides passing adventurers, Richard also saw many city merchants arriving to buy wheat. "James, James, quickly bring out your prettiest girls." Richard suddenly heard shouting from within a closed tavern, a familiar voice he recognized. It was Old Bear's voice. "Old Bear, the girls are still asleep." "They were up all night," another voice replied. "Don't refuse. Tell them I'll pay them 3 times their usual rate each." "I don't believe they won't wake up." Old Bear's voice grew louder. "Old Bear, what's wrong with you? You have a young, beautiful wife, yet you want my girls now." "Idiot, they're for my guests. They're honorable men." Some time later, Richard saw Old Bear leave the tavern with 3 blonde women dressed in elegant gowns. They seemed freshly bathed. Though their eyes still looked drowsy, their excitement was clear at the promise of hefty payment. Old Bear spotted Richard, recognizing him as the boy who had been with Mr. Joe yesterday. But perhaps too busy, he merely spared Richard a brief glance before hurrying along. Richard observed him from a distance as he entered a large concrete house, 3 stories tall. Even in Appletown, houses of that size were rare. Could they be the ones? Richard wondered. For Old Bear to accommodate them, their background had to be powerful. Ordinary adventurers would certainly be dismissed. Lord Damon, see if they suit your tastes." Old Bear shouted as he arrived at the house. Soon, 3 men emerged. One appeared to be in his 20s, with neatly combed brown hair, wearing a luxurious surcoat with a sword at his waist. His face was naturally cold, yet he smiled brightly when he saw the women Old Bear had brought. The other 2 looked to be in their 30s, likely his subordinates. Without a doubt, all 3 were magi in the ethereal realm, for they didn't bother to conceal their auras. Looks like they want to have some fun first, Richard thought. But what he didn't expect was that the man called Damon took all 3 women inside while his 2 subordinates waited outside. By his estimation, they should have acted today. Today was supposed to be the day the eggs hatched, the beasts feeding on their shells before launching their assault on the village. Of course, none of that would ever happen. Richard was confident he could deal with them, but he would wait until they made their move. "That's Damon. I wonder what he's doing here. Doesn't he usually waste his time in Night Valley City, sleeping with pretty girls?" Richard suddenly heard an adventurer speaking outside a restaurant. Curious, he approached and stood nearby to listen. "It can't be anything good. Rumor says he's been collecting human souls for someone. If he's left the city, it's probably for that. He was even brazen enough to do it in Night Valley City. Yeah, his backer is a big shot, that's why he's still alive. We'd better leave now." "Agreed, we can't afford to cross him." After their brief exchange, the adventurers mounted their horses and quickly left. Now things became clearer to Richard, though it seemed Damon himself was just someone's pawn. What? Richard was taken aback moments later. From Old Bear's house, he felt killing intent, the first time he had ever sensed it so vividly. The reason he could feel it was his affinity with the dark and blood elements. He sensed the hatred of death and the stench of spilled blood. And the dead weren't just 3, but 6. Did Old Bear and his family get killed too? Richard wondered. Damon's 2 subordinates glanced back briefly before grinning. Soon after, Damon emerged from Old Bear's house alone. He signaled his 2 men, and they mounted their horses, white steeds similar to those used by Sky Armor Knights. Of course, many could own such horses if they had the coin. They set out toward the edge of the village, in the direction of Purple Rose Village. Damon looked indifferent about most things, except when it came to beautiful women. When his eyes fell on Richard riding the red-black horse, his gaze lingered, especially on Athena. He even narrowed his eyes. After passing Richard, he glanced back, his curiosity deepening as he continued watching him. Did he sense Athena's power? Richard wondered. One thing was clear, Damon would target him sooner or later, though for now it seemed he had more pressing matters. Athena couldn't conceal her hidden aura as well as Richard could, so it was only natural for another Magus to notice her uniqueness. I'll just follow them. Richard wasn't afraid, ready to fight to the death at any moment. Boldly, he trailed them from behind. Damon, at best, was his equal in strength, given his youth. He couldn't possibly be stronger unless he was some high-level genius, but no genius would stoop to such dirty work. Richard was fairly certain of victory. With his Tier 3 ether and affinities reaching up to 90%, a single roar might be enough to end them. When their horses sped up, Athena matched their pace. When they slowed, so did she. His deliberate mirroring made them suspicious. It was clear he was tailing them. "Boss, what's that kid doing?" one of Damon's men asked. But Damon himself looked confused. He certainly hadn't expected this. In Night Valley City, children usually trembled before him. His cold face, coupled with his ruthless reputation, ensured that. Even if this boy didn't know who he was, why would he dare follow? Ignore him. Let's see what he does. He'll probably be scared to death once he sees what we're about to do, Damon said with a cold chuckle. To him, Richard was just a child, nothing to worry about. This way, he wouldn't even need to hunt him down later to claim his horse. Richard had expected Damon's nonchalance. That was the advantage of being underestimated. A child posed no threat in their eyes. Their destination was indeed Purple Rose Village. But instead of entering, they headed to a nearby hill overlooking the entire settlement. Once atop the hill, they dismounted. Whoosh! Damon suddenly waved his hand, and something appeared before him, a massive magical lamp, large enough to rival his horse. It seemed to be made entirely of gold, though a darker shade, exuding a powerful, sinister aura. Richard was a little surprised at the sight. "Ha boy, do you realize now? We are magi, and we are evil magi," one of Damon's subordinates sneered at him. But Richard remained silent. "This kid must be an idiot. He's not even running," the other laughed. "Maybe he's smarter, he knows he can't run." "You two, shut up," Damon snapped, irritated by their nonsense. Chastised, they immediately fell silent. Damon turned his gaze on Richard, raising his hand toward him. Richard instinctively stepped back. A light blue ether flared and enveloped his body, freezing him in place. "Stay there, boy. I still need you so your horse will submit to me," Damon said. This time, Richard pretended to be frightened. He couldn't move, couldn't even speak. The pale blue ether pressed down on his entire body. Of course, if he wanted to break it, it would be easy. After all, it was only Tier 2 ether. "Why haven't the beasts appeared yet?" "Not even a single roar," one of the men muttered. "Maybe soon," the other replied. Minutes passed. Damon frowned, glancing upward whenever a hawk flew overhead. He seemed puzzled by their presence. Birds should have fled sensing the danger, yet some remained. Still, Damon was patient. He waited, eyes rarely blinking. But after more than an hour with no sign of the beasts, his expression soured. "You two, check the cave. See if they've hatched yet," he ordered coldly. "Actually, you don't need to do that." A boy's voice suddenly cut in from behind, startling Damon and his subordinates. They spun around, shocked to see Richard standing freely. How's that possible? How did he break free of the boss's ether bind? What's going on? "Boy, who are you?" Damon drew his sword, pointing it at Richard. But Richard calmly replied, "Just a 7-year-old boy named Richard. As for those eggs, I destroyed them all. Naturally, no beasts will be attacking this village." "What? Boy, how dare you do that?" All three of them widened their eyes when they heard he had destroyed all the eggs. What did that mean? It meant their plan could no longer proceed, and worse, they had suffered a massive loss. Buying those eggs had cost them nearly all their wealth. They needed to harvest large numbers of souls to make back their investment and gain profit. Wait, his name is Richard. Could he be the boy everyone's been talking about lately? Looks like it. He could only have broken free of the boss's ether bind if he was at least an ether will magus. The two subordinates spoke while Damon stared at Richard with greater interest, lowering the sword he had pointed at him. He stepped forward with a smile. Boy, this is truly unexpected. But tell me, why did you do this? Did you follow me here just to tell me? Damon asked with a curious expression, but if one looked closely, it was clear he was suppressing great anger. He wasn't speaking to waste time, but rather thinking about how best to make this boy suffer before extracting value from him. Besides telling you, I'll also kill you, take your brain and your eyes. I've heard you're famous in Night Valley City. I'll make sure the people there know of your gruesome death, Richard replied. Boy, how dare you? Damon's two subordinates, who had been restraining their anger all along, glared fiercely at Richard's words. But when they moved to attack him, Damon raised his hand to stop them. The man nodded toward Richard. I like brave boys like you. It's been a long time since anyone had the guts to threaten me. And here you are, a 7-year-old, actually doing it, he said with a cold chuckle. You probably think I'm just some ignorant child, thinking I can do anything just because I became a magus at this age. You think I'm only lucky, that there's no way I could threaten you, Richard answered, making Damon's mouth fall open in surprise. His two men were even more shocked, never expecting a child to speak like that to an adult. It seems you're quite clever, boy, Damon said. Though his thoughts had been guessed, Damon refused to let himself look rattled in front of a child. Even smarter than you. Because I understand you while you don't understand me. And of course, I'm also stronger, Richard replied. Haha, you really are a magic prodigy. Damon couldn't help but laugh when Richard claimed to be stronger. Boy, how much do you even know about magic? At most, you've trained with a codex that absorbs Tier 1 ether. You must have gotten it by sheer luck. That's why you've advanced so fast here in this backwater village. You're still amazing, of course. Other geniuses couldn't reach this level even with a codex like yours under a master's guidance. But that only means your magical foundation is weak. Even I trained with a codex that absorbs Tier 2 ether. Before Damon could finish, Richard gave him a look as if staring at an idiot, making him stop mid-sentence with a scowl. Richard then said, Why are you talking about such basics? Is this Tier 1 ether? He asked, showing several strands of his own ether, deep purple in color. Damon and his men froze in shock. Purple. Tier 3. He actually has Tier 3 ether. All codices that absorb Tier 3 ether are hoarded by powerful clans. How could a village boy like him obtain one? It doesn't matter how he got it. What matters is how he advanced so quickly. This is a level of genius never before seen in history. At that moment, Damon's face darkened, realizing that during all his talking, he had made himself look like a fool. But of course, the real problem was Richard's strength. If he had Tier 3 ether, that meant he was overwhelmingly powerful. Even if he had only just entered the ethereal realm, he had already fused with the head portion of the ether skeleton. His ether accumulation was far higher than a mere beginner in that realm. What made Tier 3 ether wielders so powerful wasn't just the quality of their ether. Those who possessed it usually also had at least one elemental affinity above 80%. Boom! A wave exploded outward with Richard at the center. Knowing his opponents were magi, Richard held nothing back. He poured a great amount of ether into the blast, sharpening it to the utmost, striking both their bodies and their cores. Damon was flung away, blood spraying from his mouth. But to Richard's shock, Damon's two subordinates instantly exploded, their bodies bursting apart into countless shards of blood and flesh. Their eyes were completely annihilated. Damon's own eyes trembled at the sight. Even though his men only had Tier 1 ether and very low accumulations, they were still ether-will magi. Yet they hadn't merely died, they had been utterly obliterated. Damn you, boy! Damon slashed his sword at Richard, unleashing a massive, lightning-fast blade of wind. Richard narrowed his eyes, then stomped his foot on the ground. Thud! The earth in front of him rose up, forming a hardened wall of stone. The wind blade cut a third of the way through before dissipating. Impossible, Damon muttered in disbelief. Then the wall suddenly lurched forward, slamming into him and sending him flying back into a massive tree. So this is the difference in quality, Richard murmured. Astonished by his own power, he had thought their strengths were nearly equal. But it was like comparing a sharp blade to a rusted one. Whoosh! He waved his hand, and 4 massive shadow lions materialized in front of Damon. Each one bit down on his limbs, immobilizing him. Damon struggled, unleashing razor-sharp winds from his body, but they passed right through. The lions shifted into pure shadow. Physical attacks had no effect. Of course, this meant they couldn't deal damage either, but they could still bite him again the moment he tried to move. Damon barely had time to stand before he was bitten down once more. Richard approached Damon, who was beginning to show fear. What exactly are you? Damon asked, his voice trembling. A criminal, once thrown into a hopeless situation, would always feel greater fear. Now, Damon felt as if he were no longer facing a human being. After all, how could a 7-year-old boy be so sharp, able to read his mind so well, and wield such terrifying power? He tried to recall if there had ever been a child like this, even without such strength, but in his memory, all the 7-year-olds he had ever seen were still just playing games. Richard chuckled at his words. Do you know how disappointed I am? My first real opponent, a human I thought would give me a fun fight, turns out to be this week, he said, making Damon fall silent. But fortunately, you didn't explode like your 2 subordinates. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to take your brain and your eyes. Damon. As soon as Richard finished speaking, his hands suddenly thrust toward Damon's face, his fingers jabbing directly into the man's eyes. Damon's scream was so shrill it startled even the insects nearby. This was Richard's first act of deliberate cruelty. His previous killings had been accidents. But knowing cruelty was a necessity among magi, he forced himself to embrace it. For a moment, Damon's screaming unnerved him, but remembering what he needed to do, Richard quickly grew indifferent. Rip. He pulled the eyeballs from Damon's sockets, tearing them free and leaving his eyelids hollow. Damon only screamed louder. Unable to stand the sound, Richard stuffed a wad of grass into his mouth, silencing him. How do I take his brain? Richard muttered, and Damon could still hear him. What he needed was the brain of a villain, but in his mind, few could be more wicked than Damon, who delighted in slaughtering innocents. The only question was how to extract it without damage. Though he had Damon's sword, Richard wasn't skilled at cutting. As he thought, his eyes fell on the black ring on Damon's finger. He immediately recognized it as a storage artifact. Richard slipped it off and instantly felt the space within, peering into its contents. But aside from copper and silver coins, there seemed to be nothing of value. He squinted, scanning more carefully. In the corner, he finally spotted skeletal fragments, an arm and a leg gleaming like crystal. The ether skeleton. Each piece was incomplete, just a single arm and a single leg. Of course, one couldn't fuse with only a limb. It would destroy the body's balance. At least there's something valuable, Richard thought, feeling a flicker of satisfaction. But aside from those, there was nothing else. It seemed Damon had spent the rest of his fortune on beast eggs. Is he dead? Richard muttered in surprise when he noticed Damon was no longer breathing. His wounds weren't fatal, losing his eyes shouldn't have been enough to kill him, yet he had still died. Looks like he died from fear, Richard said. It was unexpected, but it didn't matter. All he wanted was the brain before it rotted. Still, it was ironic. Damon himself had once claimed Richard would die from fear. Richard first placed the eyeballs into the storage artifact, preserving them in its frozen stasis. Finally, he thought of a way to take the brain. He pressed his palm against Damon's hair. A searing flame burst forth, burning away the top of his skull. He stopped after only a moment. The brief blaze was enough to expose the brain. Pull. With a light suction from the storage artifact, the brain was drawn out, slowly sliding free before vanishing into storage. Damon's head was left hollow. Richard quickly stored the body too. He couldn't bear to look at it. I'll dump it in Appletown later. Humph. Whoever was behind him will be shocked to see their pawn dead so miserably while Purple Rose Village remains untouched, Richard thought. He wasn't afraid of that person. If they were too strong, then they would simply become his ancestors' problem. After all, his ancestors' strength was rising rapidly every day. A peak magus who only needed to recover his power. Richard also took Damon's sword, then turned his eyes toward the massive magic lamp. That must be the artifact that absorbs and seals souls, he thought. Placing his hand on it, he sensed a mysterious inner space, unseeable, but perceivable. Inside were 3 trapped souls. They felt like Damon's and his 2 subordinates. If one died near the lamp, their soul was absorbed automatically. Holding the artifact, Richard gained a faint understanding. It required souls as its energy source. It couldn't run on anything else. That was likely why Damon had killed Old Bear and the others. And this must be incredibly expensive, Richard mused. He stored it as well before glancing at the 3 white horses Damon's group had used. But he was too lazy to deal with them. Instead, he mounted Athena, patting her side so she began to run. The day was still long, he had time for more. With Damon dealt with, Richard planned to head back to Appletown. With Athena's current speed, they could reach it much faster than before. His name was already stirring rumors there, but no one knew his true identity. Olivia must have fled already. There was no way she'd dare remain in the city while being hunted by the Moonshadow clan. Richard didn't rush into the town. He stopped at the edge of a forest on the outskirts, sliding down from Athena's back. Knowing the city held many magi, he decided not to bring her inside, too conspicuous. They would surely sense she was no ordinary horse. He left her hidden in the forest. If danger arose, she could always escape. Once Athena disappeared into the woods, Richard walked alone toward the city gates, blending in like an ordinary child. He had a few copper coins ready to pay, but as a lone boy, the guards didn't even bother asking for toll. They just shoved him inside. I still need 9 more pairs of eyes, Richard thought, gazing at Appletown while wondering where he could obtain them. To acquire such things meant he had to blind 9 more people. It sounded cruel, but he could always do it to criminals. In Appletown, criminals were not hard to find. Almost everywhere, gangs could be seen harassing merchants for money. In this city, they were practically untouchable, always backed in secret by officials who took their share of the profits. Richard didn't even need to search. He could find their lairs easily. One such hideout was a large, 2-story abandoned building. Richard only had to stand before it to smell the heavy stench of alcohol. It was empty for the moment. The gangsters were out collecting money. The door wasn't even locked. Richard simply stepped inside and was greeted by piles of jars and bottles. Torn women's clothing littered the floor. Bloodstains could still be seen. Richard slowed his breathing, unable to stand the stench of alcohol. But his curiosity won out, and he climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. There were 2 doorless rooms. He peeked inside each and found beds, not bad ones, but messy, clearly used for all sorts of worldly pleasures. He entered one of the rooms and approached a slightly open wardrobe, sensing a faint aura within. When he opened it, he was startled to find a pile of glowing stones, 15 in total. Nature spirits, he whispered, never expecting to find such treasures in a gang's lair. 15 wasn't much, but to someone who had none, it was priceless. At the very least, it meant he wouldn't need to hastily sell the hilt of the Obsidora wood sword. With his current amount of ether, even 5 of them could quickly replenish what he spent. Without hesitation, he moved them into his ring. To him, this wasn't theft, he had come here to slaughter. Besides the spirits, Richard also spotted a book. Opening it, he realized it was a codex titled Codex of Giant Human. But it could only absorb Tier 1 ether. Its sole advantage was the ability to enlarge one's body. Richard wasn't interested, yet he stored it anyway. His eyes narrowed at the sight of a chest under the bed. With a swift pull, he dragged it out. It wasn't even locked. Inside was a pile of copper and silver coins, filling nearly 1/3 of the chest. For common folk, it was no small fortune. I'm rich, ha. Richard couldn't hold back his laughter, it even came out rather loudly. Who's there? A sudden shout came from below, making Richard snap his mouth shut. Are they back? He muttered, quickly storing the chest before standing near the door as heavy footsteps approached. Moments later, a burly middle-aged man appeared, thick mustache and beard making him look like a bear in human form. Both froze in shock, the gangster, seeing a child in their room, Richard, seeing such a large man. Even the bravest men didn't dare intrude into their lair. Who would have thought a boy would? Soon, more men arrived, this time younger, in their 20s and 30s. Who's this kid? What's he doing here? Can't you see? He's clearly stealing. What? A brat daring to steal from us. The gangsters muttered in disbelief. But Richard only gave a faint smile. Quietly, he released a small wave of power. Too large, and they would simply explode. This one, however, struck directly at their hearts, making them burst. One by one, they collapsed, eyes wide open. Richard didn't bother speaking with them. He killed them quickly. Then he walked over. I suppose I'm starting to get used to this dirty work, he said with a bitter smile before plucking out their eyes, collecting 9 pairs. Afterward, he left casually, slipping out the window. What followed was something he hadn't expected. Ding! Your mastery over Codex of Moonshadow has increased from 8% to 11%. Your mastery over 100 Shadow Monster has increased from 8% to 11%. Your mastery over Lighting of Darkness has increased from 7% to 11%. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 31%. Codex of Moonshadow, 11%. Arcane Arts, 100 Shadow Monster, 11%. Lighting of Darkness, 11%. One notification after another appeared as he stepped out of the window, bringing a wide smile to Richard's face. I can finally begin the ritual. I've gathered everything I need, except the Virgin's blood still in the Fire Spirit Queen's body, he thought. Of course, he could find such blood in the city, but there was no need. He planned to perform the ritual in his ancestor's hut, where it would be far safer. Richard didn't rush home. He strolled around. After all, he still hadn't disposed of Damon's gruesome corpse. Now he was free, able to wander wherever he wished, eventually reaching the district lined with magic shops. Though Appletown was small, its people studied magic, and it even had a school. Naturally, the city had shops selling magical wares, though all of them were modest in size. They traded in codices, arcane arts, weapons, artifacts, and mystical plants. Richard had originally intended to sell his sword hilt here, but now that he had both money and nature spirits, he decided against it. He came only to browse. The first shop he saw made him pause, watching from outside. It had a single display table filled with ancient books, mixed with strange objects, while swords and spears hung along the walls. He even spotted sky armor, something magi often wore for protection. What's that? Richard's eyes narrowed at a plate-like object inside the display, feeling a strange connection to it. It seemed tied to one of his powers, but with so many elements at his disposal, he couldn't be sure which. Richard suspected it might be something that could help one of his elements perform in a more amazing way. As far as he knew, when elemental affinity reached 90%, one did tend to be able to sense things that were beneficial to them. Richard couldn't resist taking a closer look at the plate-like object, so he stepped into the shop. A few others were also browsing inside, most of them middle-aged, around 40 years or older. For people in such remote regions, it was usually around that age when they first managed to step into the ethereal realm. Even so, that was enough to turn their previously ordinary lives into extraordinary ones. Most visitors were there to examine weapons or books containing arcane arts. They seemed uninterested in the artifacts on display. The reason was simple: almost all the artifacts being sold had unclear functions. Buying them was like gambling, paying a high price first, only to study them later, and in most cases, discovering nothing of value. Of course, if someone actually understood the true function of one of these seemingly useless artifacts, then the price asked could be considered dirt cheap. Richard finally stood in front of the display case, getting his first close look at the plate. At first, he thought it was made of glass, but upon closer inspection, it was actually clay that had been hardened and polished until it became so smooth. Its price tag read 50 nature spirits, far more expensive than Richard had expected, since he only carried 15. "Boy, are you interested in this plate?" The shop owner, a thin old man dressed in luxurious robes, asked with a broad smile. He probably assumed Richard was the son of a wealthy family, already being trained in magic and even given nature spirits to shop for magical items. After all, despite his shabby clothes, Richard's delicate face and clean skin often gave him an air that overshadowed his poor appearance. Moreover, the nature spirits stored in his pocket were something the old man could sense, so naturally, Richard seemed capable of making a purchase. When coming here, Richard had intentionally moved his nature spirits into his pocket. "I want to buy it, but I once saw an item like this in Night Valley City for only 10 nature spirits. I thought it would be cheaper here, but who would have thought it'd be so expensive?" Richard replied, causing the old man's smile to freeze. "Nonsense. Who would sell it for 10 nature spirits? I bought it myself for 40, the shopkeeper said in disbelief, though his eyes betrayed the feeling that he might have been duped by whoever sold it to him. He thought this way because Richard didn't seem like he was lying. After all, a 7-year-old child wouldn't make up such a story just to lower a price. "Ha ha. Ford, looks like you're not that great at the artifact business after all. If something like this was being sold for 10 nature spirits in Night Valley City, that means it had no value whatsoever. Shops there often put items on display at such prices just to fill their shelves, without any expectation they'll ever sell. If you ask me, you should just give that plate to the boy," one of the older visitors laughed, mocking the shopkeeper. Ford's face turned purple and red, as if his head had been set ablaze. "Impossible. I bought this from a trustworthy magus," he retorted. "Even if you bought it from a magus, that doesn't mean he knew it wasn't useless. But if it's from a Night Valley City shop, then there's no doubt. Ha ha." Meanwhile, Richard quietly made his way toward the door. "Boy, wait," Ford suddenly called out. Richard stopped and looked back with an innocent, questioning expression. "If you really want the plate, I'll sell it to you," he said. "It's too expensive," Richard replied. "Then what price do you want to pay?" "I can only afford 5 nature spirits." Upon hearing this, Ford's face twitched as though he were about to cry. But who could he blame? Before he realized it, his head nodded even as his mouth spoke the words. "Fine, 5 nature spirits." Richard quickly pulled out 5 nature spirits from his pocket and handed them over, while the old man accepted them with a scowl. "Give me the plate," Richard said. "Calm down," the old man muttered, taking the plate from inside the display case before handing it to Richard. It wasn't very large, but it turned out to be surprisingly heavy. Richard carried it with a smile and left the shop, while the shopkeeper glared at the 5 nature spirits in his hand with an expression full of resentment. "Damn it," he cursed. "Ford, you've only got yourself to blame," the older man from before remarked again. Better than ending up with nothing," Ford said bitterly, trying to comfort himself. Richard wandered into another part of town, already wanting to return to his village. He could feel an even stronger connection to the plate now, but this wasn't the right place to examine it. Nor was he sure he could uncover its mysteries on his own. What he needed was a safe place where he could study the plate properly. But before that, he had to dispose of Damon's corpse. That was tricky, considering how crowded every part of town was. It didn't take long, however, before he found a spot, a noble's abandoned carriage by the roadside. Passing by it, he only needed to slip his hand through the window for a moment. Damon's corpse fell inside from his storage artifact. With that done, Richard left Appletown quickly. Outside the town, he gave a whistle, and Athena came trotting out of the forest toward him. Meanwhile, back at Ford's shop, a startling figure arrived, the city lord himself, Liam, a man with neatly combed blonde hair. Ford rubbed his eyes in disbelief that the city lord had come. But even more shocking was the guest who accompanied him, the young man with messy curly brown hair, no more than 15 years old, who had previously visited the shop without buying anything. Ford remembered him clearly. He had come before Richard. "Ronan, where is it?" the city lord asked the youth. "Here." Ronan pointed at the display case, only to freeze in shock when he saw it. "Where is it?" "Old man, where's the plate that was here earlier?" he demanded of Ford. The city lord's brows furrowed as his eyes shifted toward him. Ford stammered in confusion before answering truthfully, "It was just purchased by a child." "What? Where is that child?" the city lord suddenly barked. "He left a while ago," Ford said nervously, finally realizing something was wrong. That plate, could it actually be priceless? To the point where even the city lord himself came looking for it? Ford couldn't help but wonder. "Describe him to me," the city lord ordered, already knowing what needed to be done. And so, Boss Ford began describing the boy, estimating his age to be around 7 or 8. He told everything without daring to add or omit a single detail, even mentioning to the city lord that the boy had said the plate was being sold for only 10 nature spirit in Night Valley City, and that was why he ended up selling it for 5. The usually calm city lord staggered when he heard this, calling Boss Ford an idiot before leaving without giving him the chance to ask what the plate really was. Of course, Ford finally realized he had been deceived by that boy. Slumping back in his chair, his mind replayed everything that had just happened, how the boy had entered, how he had studied the plate, and how Ford himself had approached with the gaze of a predator looking for profit. Bang! He slammed the table hard as the memory struck him again. "Damn it, I'll kill that brat," he roared, his voice carrying across to the neighboring shops. Richard had no idea that the item he had just bought was also being sought by the city lord. Right now, he was focused on resisting the gusts of wind generated by Athena's speed. If he didn't hold on tightly, he would have been thrown off entirely. Only when they arrived at Red Wheat Village did Athena finally slow down. They passed through the village at a leisurely pace, and Richard couldn't help but glance at Old Bear's house. It stood silent. There might not even be corpses left. So how could the other villagers ever realize that Old Bear and his family had been slaughtered? Richard shook his head. He could only say Old Bear's fate had been truly unfortunate. After passing the village, Athena picked up her speed once again. In the sky, Richard noticed many birds flying back toward the mountains. They seemed like migratory birds returning now that their territory was safe again. By the time Richard reached his village, the sky had already turned dusky. After greeting Sister Lisa briefly, he hurried straight toward his ancestral hut. As night fell, the old man was busy lighting bonfires and torches around the hut, roasting a massive fish that looked freshly caught. Seeing Richard arrive, he said, "You look quite spirited." "Of course, I've collected 1 criminal's brain and 10 pairs of eyes," Richard replied. "Now I can start the ritual." "How about the old woman's blood, grandfather?" "Don't worry, I've already taken it." Aldrich showed Richard a tightly sealed jar. "Excellent." Richard couldn't be happier, forgetting the plate-like artifact for now. He stepped up onto the porch of the ancestral hut and pulled out the brain and all the eyes he had collected. "So, you already have a storage artifact?" Aldrich said, slightly surprised. "Yes, I took it from the owner of this brain. He's the one who planted the beast eggs to massacre the village." "His brain should qualify," Richard replied. "Your luck can be said to be rather high," Aldrich nodded. "All right, I'll be watching. You can begin the ritual. If something goes wrong, I'll stop you." "Yes." Richard sat down. He knew exactly what needed to be done. At this moment, Aldrich placed the jar in front of him and removed its lid. Inside, Richard saw a clear, crimson liquid. It looked less like blood and more like water dyed red. Its scent even surprised him, strangely fragrant, despite being blood. "This is the blood of the second greatest beauty of the previous era," Aldrich remarked. Richard rolled his eyes at that. From his guess, his ancestor must have been a playboy, though clearly he had never managed to capture the most prestigious targets. Richard then placed each pair of eyes into the jar, which was fortunately large enough to contain them all. If he also put Damon's brain inside, along with its dark element, it would transform into something capable of summoning malevolent souls. Taking a deep breath, Richard began releasing his dark element. The jet black energy seeped into Damon's brain until it too turned dark. He then mixed the corrupted brain into the blood already mingled with the 10 pairs of eyes. Boom! Suddenly, a plume of black, evil smoke erupted from within the jar. At the same time, Richard saw shadowy humanoid figures emerging. They looked like silhouettes, but their glow was crimson as if made of blood, their faces endlessly distorted. In Richard's imagination, such beings could only be called wraiths, feral specters. Whoosh! 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 They suddenly lunged at him, straight into his chest. Yet instead of an attack, they merged with him, slipping directly into his chest. Immediately, Richard felt something gathering within his heart, making his chest unbearably heavy, an utterly uncomfortable sensation. The only good thing was that there was no pain. Even so, the heaviness grew and grew. He could feel hatred and malice seeping into his heart, spreading into his mind. For a moment, his thoughts grew chaotic. He nearly lost himself, but just as quickly, another force cleared the corruption away. Minutes after minute passed and Richard could feel a kind of change in his heart. Buzz. A black light suddenly radiated from him, not ordinary light, but his very soul. The black radiance expanded, swelling larger than Aldrich's hut. When it reached its limit, it began to take shape, forming a massive black dragon with icy red eyes, clad in shadowy armor that seemed made to fit its body. Richard stared in shock. A special soul was different from an ordinary one. A special soul could take form, but it wasn't something one could simply shape at will. Its form had to correspond to a person's inherent power. Richard had merely thought fleetingly of its shape, and it had manifested instantly. Then the dragon's mouth opened wide. Roar! The deafening roar shook the land and space itself, rattling trees, scattering animals, and snuffing out every flame. Even Aldrich leapt in surprise. The roar echoed all the way to Purple Rose Village, extinguishing the torches the villagers had just lit. From such a distance, they couldn't be sure whether it was a roar or thunder. But one thing was certain, it was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard. Ding! Your soul has transformed into the Black Heart Soul, turning your heart into the Black Heart, capable of storing the hidden power of wrath and resentment. Status. Name, Richard. Magic Realm, Ether Will. Ether, 144/10-000, Tier 3. Ether Accumulation, 2144, Tier 3. Soul, Black Heart Soul. Black Heart Hidden Power, 0/10-000. Notice, Black Heart Hidden Power can be used to increase your ether accumulation when activated. Ding! Your Black Heart Hidden Power has increased from 0 to 1. Your Black Heart Hidden Power has increased from 1 to 2. Your Black Heart Hidden Power has increased from 2 to 3. Black Heart Hidden Power, 3/10-000, plus 3. Richard. How was he supposed to know that the system would even increase the hidden power of his heart, something he thought could only be obtained through slaughter? The process was faster than Richard had expected. His soul had changed, and he could feel his thinking speed increase drastically. The codex and arcane art, which had once felt like a dead end when he tried to master them on his own, now became clear. If before he felt as if they were tangled threads impossible to fix, now he could see the strands and their paths. Slowly, he would surely be able to mend them. Of course, he realized the existence of the holy flame played a major role in speeding up this process. Otherwise, he would have had to endure a much longer and more painful path. Not long after, black smoke seeped out of his body. Those evil souls had perished from exhaustion, dispersing from his body, leaving behind only the changes they had made. Richard then looked at his ancestor, who gave him a gaze full of interest. Have you obtained the inheritance of the Dragon Knight? A soul forming a dragon. As far as I know, only the codex cultivated by Dragon Knights could achieve that, he said. Aldrich knew Richard had cultivated a codex that absorbed Tier 3 ether before he gave him the Codex of Moonshadow. But he hadn't known what kind of codex that was. Now he understood. Considering Richard had also gained the method to cultivate the Black Heart Soul, which belonged to the Dragon Knight, it could only be said he had indeed inherited it. Richard smiled and nodded lightly. But it's only the codex I cultivated and the Black Heart Soul book I obtained, he said. Compared to my inheritance, the Dragon Knight's inheritance is still greater, Aldrich replied. I can train both, Richard answered. Yeah, that's the amazing part. You're cultivating both well. Even while practicing the inheritance of the Dragon Knight, you're cultivating it better than the Dragon Knight himself. As he said this, Aldrich seemed truly astonished at Richard's talent. The boy could only chuckle with a shy expression. By the way, grandfather, do you know what this object is? I feel like it has a specialty, so I bought it at a magic shop. Richard pulled out a plate-like object he had purchased. The moment he took it out, Aldrich snatched it with such speed that Richard couldn't even see the movement. He stared at the plate with wide, astonished eyes. You're truly lucky, boy. How much did you pay for this? He asked. Richard's eyes lit up at those words, for his ancestor clearly recognized this plate-like object, and it was obviously a treasure of great value. Only 5 nature spirits, he replied, causing Aldrich's eyes to bulge. Grandfather, what exactly is this? Richard asked. You must realize this is soil? Yes, it is soil, but it seems extremely dry. Correct. It's called Simera soil, something that enhances affinity with the earth element. With this, one might be able to raise their earth element affinity to 90%. Really? Richard was somewhat astonished. Such an item, its value was immeasurable. Anyone possessing earth-type power would surely desire it, for their strength would become extraordinary if their earth element affinity reached 90%. But Richard furrowed his brows, wondering what use it had for him, who already possessed 90% earth element affinity. Of course, you can't just use it directly. One needs to slowly absorb the essence of this Simera soil to increase their earth element affinity, Aldrich continued. To produce more essence, feed it with nature spirit's energy. And if someone's earth element affinity has already reached 90%, can the essence of Simera soil still raise it further? Unfortunately, from what I know, not even Simera soil can help beyond that. It needs something greater than that. Oh. Richard felt slightly disappointed. Does it have any other use? He asked. Yes, it can be used to cultivate magical plants. This is extraordinary, for normally it is very difficult to cultivate such plants. But with this soil, there's no effort needed, only time. As he said this, Aldrich handed the object back to Richard, who stared at it in wonder. How can soil this hard be planted on? He asked. It's not like that. You only need to bury it beneath the soil you plan on. What matters is the essence of the Simera soil, Aldrich replied, and Richard finally understood. Later, seek out seeds of magical plants. You can try it. Richard nodded, but still wasn't sure if he needed to. His training path was different. He didn't always need what others needed. Such a treasure might end up being only part of his collection. Of course, he could also exchange it for another treasure of equal value. He stored the object away again. Grandfather, I'll return for now, he said. Back in the village, Richard found some villagers still lingering, talking about the loud sound they had just heard until their torch flames went out. There were 2 opposing opinions. Some insisted it was thunder, others claimed it was a terrifying beast. Richard couldn't care less. He entered the orphanage and joined the others for dinner. Tonight, unexpectedly, they were eating beef, something incredibly rare. Richard didn't know where Sister Lisa had gotten it. He couldn't help but eat a lot. The only problem was the limited portion. As Richard was about to enter his room to train, Sister Lisa suddenly called out to him. Richard, will you accompany me tomorrow? The woman asked. Richard was somewhat surprised to hear this, as it was the first time. Where? He asked curiously. Sister Lisa rarely went anywhere, and usually she went alone. Since this time she wanted him to accompany her, Richard couldn't help but think this might not be an ordinary trip. Night Valley City, Sister Lisa replied, causing Richard's eyes to tremble slightly. I need your horse so we can get there faster, she added with a soft laugh. All right, I'll go with you, Richard answered, filled with anticipation. The city where he was born, where his fate had begun, why not? Having only seen it as a baby, he wasn't too clear about the city itself, but he knew it was magnificent. Hearing his agreement, Sister Lisa looked pleased. Go to bed early tonight. "We'll begin our journey before sunrise," she said before walking away. Richard entered his room and immediately went to sleep. He had done far too much today. He couldn't deny he was tired and wanted to rest well. Because he had gone to bed so early, Richard also woke up early. He already felt refreshed and became even more so when he received a notification from the system. Your black heart hidden power has increased from 3 to 10. Your affinity with the cloud element has increased from 58 to 60. Black heart hidden power, 10/10, 000, plus 7. Cloud, 60%. Looks like the system will be giving 9 upgrades now, Richard thought with a smile. He stretched his body before standing up and heading straight to the bathroom. To his surprise, Sister Lisa was already ready before him, even looking as if she had already bathed. She was standing at the orphanage gate, talking to a middle-aged woman who lived next door. Whenever she left, she usually asked this woman to take care of the orphanage temporarily. The woman immediately went to the kitchen to cook breakfast for the children. It seemed Sister Lisa wanted to leave before the children woke up. Richard hurried his bath, abandoning his original plan to enjoy it leisurely. Since they were going to a big city, he chose good clothes. Of course, he had a few gifts from Mrs. Wilson. What surprised him even more was that Sister Lisa had actually prepared a carriage. It seemed to belong to a villager whom she had borrowed it from. "Richard, harness your horse to this carriage. The journey is very long, so it's better if we travel inside," the woman said. Richard naturally preferred this. After all, sitting on horseback for long periods was no easy matter. Athena didn't mind being tasked with pulling the carriage. She followed Richard's instructions well, so nothing was complicated. Sister Lisa didn't seem to be bringing much. Other than some clothes and fruits for the road, she carried a sword, likely anticipating possible danger along the way. As a former Sky Armor Knight, she practically possessed combat skills. Even though she lacked superhuman strength without the Sky Armor and was only an ordinary magus who hadn't reached the Ethereal Realm, having only Tier 1 Ether, Sister Lisa might still be able to defeat them. "Didn't you bring any clothes?" Sister Lisa asked after letting Richard board the carriage first. Richard shook his head. He hadn't packed any clothes at all in his storage artifact. He planned to buy new ones later. Sister Lisa didn't say anything more. She climbed onto the carriage and then went to sit in the driver's seat. The carriage wasn't that big, but for Richard, who was still small, it was spacious enough. He could even lie down if he wanted. Sister Lisa, seated on the driver's bench, quickly guided Athena to move. Carriages in this world weren't that bad. They were designed well enough that the vibrations weren't too noticeable. Once they had left the village, Athena began to move quickly. In no time, her speed surpassed even the fastest horses, astonishing Sister Lisa. "Sister, what exactly are you going to do in Night Valley City?" Richard asked, curious about her destination. "To obtain a sky armor," Sister Lisa replied. "Really?" Richard was very surprised to hear that. "Though I retired from the Sky Armor Legion long ago, that doesn't mean I stopped training. I've continued practicing every day. After all, the training isn't that complicated, one can do it anywhere. I've improved several times over while managing the orphanage. Yesterday, an old friend who had been traveling the world sent me a letter, saying she would give me an unusual sky armor. That's something I can't refuse. Perhaps she heard about the crisis this village just faced and took pity on me for not being able to rely on myself." Sister Lisa chuckled. Richard immediately grew curious about the friend she mentioned. Someone who traveled the world? Also, we'll be watching the finals of the Young Magus tournament. This tournament is joined by the best young magi from the 8-star, 9-star, and 10-star provinces, so the two competing in the finals are the strongest under 20 years old. "It's held in Night Valley City," Sister Lisa added, surprising Richard again. "Sister, what kind of tournament is that?" he asked. He truly had never heard of it, not even in Appletown, even though it seemed like such a major event. Perhaps he had simply never happened to overhear anyone talk about it. Of course, it's a tournament of combat and power. It's held once every 5 years by the kingdom. The champions of the 3 provinces are then sent to the capital to compete in the final stage of the tournament against the champions of the other 3 provinces, Sister Lisa explained. There's something like that. Richard hadn't expected it. It's a grand festival, the biggest one, in fact. Of course, villagers like us rarely attend, but people from the major cities in this province and the other two will come to watch. Richard was filled with anticipation, but he didn't want to waste his time. Since he hadn't trained last night, he planned to train relentlessly during this journey. He even ignored Sister Lisa when she asked if he wanted to stop for food. Since he gave no response, Sister Lisa was forced to keep going. Richard was quite excited while training, as his absorption speed for ether had increased by about 50% since his soul had transformed. In just over 10 hours, he managed to gather 39 ether. Adding what he received from his ether bottle, he obtained 78 in total. Ether, 222/10,000, Tier 3, plus 78. Ether accumulation, 222 Tier 3. The reason he stopped training after gathering 39 ether was because he began to hear many voices around them. Curious as to where they were, he opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the towering wall ahead, visible even from afar. He could never forget that wall, knowing it belonged to Night Valley City and stood 50 meters high. All around, he noticed many other carriages heading in the same direction. They were traveling along a road so wide that 20 carriages could move side by side. On either side of the road, Richard saw vast open areas that had become a beast market. His eyes no longer blinked as he saw all kinds of beasts, some so massive they had to be chained or locked inside giant cages. He even saw a lion 10 meters tall, becoming the center of attention in the market. Isn't it amazing? Here, everything has sellers, even humans, said Sister Lisa. What? There's human trafficking too? Is that even allowed? Richard wasn't surprised by this, but he pretended to be, wanting to know more. Of course, it's not allowed, but there will always be black markets that are hard to eradicate, Sister Lisa replied. Richard only smiled quietly at that. The reason it was so hard to stamp out was most likely because those in power also profited from such businesses. By the way, Sister Lisa, isn't it dangerous to buy those wild beasts? Couldn't they attack their owners? Not always. Many of those beasts were raised in captivity, so they're somewhat tame. As for the wild ones, people usually buy them for research or entertainment, so they keep them locked up. Oh, Richard nodded. This beast market was outside the city, but even after passing it, the city walls were still quite far away. Of course, many other businesses line the road to the city, with the most common being pleasure houses guarded by beautiful women. Night Valley City seemed overcrowded already, so many couldn't find a place to open businesses inside. When they finally arrived in front of its towering 50-meter-high walls, Richard realized just how tall they were. Even the gates were 40 meters wide, yet despite their size, people still crowded desperately to get in. And that was only one of its gates. In fact, there were more than 50. The good thing was, there was no entry fee. Perhaps only during these few days, since the city had become a destination for people from 3 provinces. Once through the gate, Richard finally saw clearly the grandeur of this vast city, so wide that the walls on the far side couldn't be seen at all, which meant they were extremely far away. However, faintly, Richard spotted a rocky hill in the distance, a sight that made him narrow his eyes. How could he forget that he had been brought from that rocky hill? But seeing it from afar clearly meant nothing. He focused on his surroundings instead, observing the newcomers who looked different from those of Appletown. In this city, that ancient atmosphere was less pronounced, people's clothes were more vibrant, the buildings painted in various colors, and life itself seemed so lively. Richard, let's eat first. I'm far too hungry, said Sister Lisa, and Richard nodded without protest, for he felt the same. Sister Lisa stopped the horse carriage in front of a large restaurant that seemed inexpensive, since many outsiders were eating there. The food sold seemed to consist of meat soup and roasted meat, but the most intriguing thing was that they had ice for their drinks. Sister Lisa picked a table and ordered 2 servings. Here, we can drink iced water. You've probably never tried it before. Even in Appletown, it's hard to find. Bringing in ice from other regions is practically impossible, but in this city, there's no shortage of magi with ice powers, explained Sister Lisa. Richard only chuckled at her words, feigning curiosity. Their order came quickly. Along with 2 bowls of soup and 2 roasted meats, there were 2 pitchers emitting a frosty mist. Looking into the pitchers, Richard saw water mixed with chunks of ice. Though ice was common on Earth, he hadn't tasted it in over 7 years in this world. Without hesitation, he drank the iced water first, which instantly refreshed his body. Sister Lisa did the same, drinking first. "Amazing, isn't it?" she said. Richard only nodded and began to eat. "You heard? Damon's corpse has been found in Appletown. They said it was without eyes and a brain." Richard suddenly caught an interesting conversation from the table next to theirs. "Really? Was Damon killed? Who killed him?" "No one knows. His body was apparently dumped in a noble's carriage. Some people said that earlier he'd been wandering around villages near Appletown. Perhaps he provoked someone he shouldn't have. In Night Valley City, he could act like a tyrant because he was protected by many noble families, but elsewhere, there are plenty who could kill him, and they wouldn't be afraid." Sister Lisa, who also heard this, furrowed her brows. She didn't seem unfamiliar with the name Damon. "Richard," she said quietly. What is it?" Richard asked, pretending to be surprised. "You were wandering around yesterday. Did you see a magus fight?" Sister Lisa asked. "No." Richard shook his head. "Sister Lisa, do you know this man named Damon?" he asked. Of course, it was natural for him to ask since he'd heard the talk about Damon as well. "Not personally, but I know quite a lot about him from my aunt." "Oh." Richard grew more interested. "He did bad things for Ren. Ren is the governor's son. He's one of the ones who will fight in the finals," added Sister Lisa. "Ren." Richard repeated the name. He hadn't expected to get this information from Sister Lisa. Now he knew who the true mastermind was. Though he had no interest in getting involved, since his focus remained on his own growth, knowing was better than not knowing. And Ren had no idea that it was Richard who had killed his lackey. Richard continued eating, finishing his meal quickly. But truthfully, he still felt unsatisfied. He wanted more. Without telling Sister Lisa, he called a waiter and ordered another portion, surprising Sister Lisa enough that her expression turned uneasy. But Richard calmly pulled out a few copper and silver coins. "Sister, I'll be paying," Richard said casually. He knew Sister Lisa's finances were limited. Naturally, he couldn't let her pay for everything. "You?" Sister Lisa was stunned, taking a coin and examining it closely. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "I have power. Earning money isn't difficult for me," Richard replied calmly. "You didn't rob anyone, did you?" "I did rob, but what I robbed was a group of criminals who deserved to suffer." "Lisa." Richard and Sister Lisa continued their journey deeper into the city. The streets here branched out too much, but just because the buildings were beautiful, Richard couldn't say the city was well planned. Many streets were slanted or uneven in size. As they went further in, Richard realized things were not as good as he had imagined. The city was not without its poor. In fact, they looked even poorer than villagers, as if the word suffering was etched onto their faces. They lived in slums with houses made of old wood, wearing robes that were worn out and patched all over. Many children begged for money from passers-by or scavenged food from the trash. As Richard observed, he realized the slums in this city were not few in number. They just weren't visible near the city gates. But when entering the elite district, Richard easily forgot those slum areas. So many luxurious restaurants, gown and jewelry shops visited by charming young women. From time to time, he also saw massive magic shops visited by many magi, and magi of the ethereal realm were actually quite common everywhere. Many were only in their 20s, with some even reaching that realm at age 17 or 18. "Richard, the ethereal realm is fairly ordinary here. Of course, it's impossible to find someone as young as you. Among the many magi in the ethereal realm, those who can fight primordial beasts of tier 8, 9, or 10 are the rarest. Most magi in the ethereal realm, even if they have enough ether and are only lacking one piece of the ether framework. At most they're equal to Tier 6 or 7 primordial beasts. If they have Tier 2 ether, they're equal to Tier 8 or 9 primordial beasts. To fight a Tier 10 beast, it takes some extraordinary arcane arts, Sister Lisa explained, giving Richard knowledge he had already learned from Olivia. Perhaps Sister Lisa assumed he didn't know that much yet. Richard nodded a few times in response. "Are there any magi with Tier 3 ether in this city?" he asked. "Lady Rebecca, my aunt's master," Sister Lisa answered with an expression full of admiration. "Also Ren, though some rumors say his ether isn't that stable. He seems to have forced himself too much to master a codex that absorbs Tier 3 ether." After saying that, Sister Lisa gave Richard a strange look. "What is it?" Richard pretended to be confused, though he knew Sister Lisa was simply curious about him, since he wasn't only in the ethereal realm, he even had Tier 3 ether. "It's nothing." Sister Lisa shook her head. "Sister, what about magi in the life ether realm?" Richard asked, curious about those in the stronger realm. In that realm, a person's ether becomes alive, and that was why magi needed the ether framework, to allow their bodies to control living ether. Living ether was, of course, different from the ether of magi below the life ether realm. It could be released to carry out tasks on its own in battle without further command from its magus. The transformation wasn't huge, but besides having much greater power, their fighting style became far more troublesome. "They are the true holders of power," Sister Lisa replied. "For all noble clans, they are revered elders, except for the Moonshadow clan, since their standards and strength are still higher even though they are considered in decline." "Aunt Wilson is in this realm," Sister Lisa said. "Above them, there's no need to mention. They are the leaders. Half of them in this city are from the Moonshadow clan." "They're really that strong even though they've declined?" "Yeah, they're that strong because they once had an ancestor who reached the very peak of the world. You understand how powerful that clan is, so you'd better avoid them if you ever encounter them. If we get into trouble with them, even Mrs. Wilson would find it hard to help, despite being Lady Rebecca's personal maid." Richard nodded, but inwardly smiled. That clan, he was the original young master of it. He was merely abandoned. Sister Lisa suddenly turned into a street lined with houses of similar appearance, medium in size, but seemingly luxurious. It appeared to be a housing complex, something he hadn't found in Appletown. But since Night Valley City was so large, it was likely there were many complexes built by those in the property business. Soon after, Sister Lisa stopped the carriage in front of one of the houses. Richard couldn't help but feel strange when he saw the house, as its roof was full of crows resting there. Some flew away, but others came to take their place. This complex clearly wasn't some gathering ground for crows, since none were perched on other roofs. Don't be too surprised. Lilith can be considered an odd magus, but she's very kind and very strong as well, Sister Lisa said, noticing Richard's bewilderment. She got off the carriage from the front while Richard got down from the back. Just as Richard landed on the ground, the house door suddenly opened. A beautiful young girl, about the same age as Richard, with black hair and blood-red eyes and straight bangs, stepped out of the door along with a young woman in her 20s wearing a maid uniform. "Is that the woman?" Richard asked instinctively in surprise. He was stunned because to him, the girl was far too beautiful for her age. "No, they're guests," Sister Lisa answered, and Richard then noticed another carriage besides theirs. The difference was that carriage was too luxurious, seemingly made of gold, its windows covered with silk curtains. The girl and her maid headed toward that carriage, their eyes briefly glancing at Richard and Sister Lisa. The girl looked very cold, yet she still carried an air of curiosity toward them, especially Richard, who was the same age as her. She stared at him long enough as if observing him. After that, she entered the carriage and it soon departed. Richard kept watching the carriage until it disappeared. He could sense the uniqueness of that girl and knew she was extraordinary. "Hey, Richard, do you like her? That girl really is too beautiful. When she grows up, she'll surely become stunning and pursued by many men. If you're truly interested in her, I think you should approach her from this age. You know, There's always a different feeling for women toward men they've known since childhood. Richard. Meanwhile, in Appletown, Liam, the city lord, was doing everything he could to investigate the 7-year-old boy who had purchased the Cimera soil. He gathered every person who had seen Richard in Appletown. He even went as far as hiring the best painter, then ordered those who had seen Richard to describe his features to the painter. The result was a sketch that was strikingly accurate. Liam studied the sketch intently, trying to recall Richard's appearance. A 7-year-old boy able to fabricate such a lie, who taught him that, he wondered. But he must have sensed that plate, or there is no way he would want to obtain it. And he's only 7 years old. The longer Liam stared at the sketch, the deeper his suspicion grew. He suspected this boy was the very Richard who had caused such a stir in Appletown. First of all, despite being only 7 years old, he had easily cleared the challenge in the dark forest. Then he had exposed Olivia's crimes, forcing her to flee to who knows where. I suppose there's no doubt. There's no way two such extraordinary children could appear in Appletown, Liam thought. But Liam furrowed his brows. If he wished, he truly could locate Richard using the sketch. Some magi possessed that skill. As long as they saw an image of the person they were searching for, they could track them. Of course, there was a limit to the range they could trace. If the target was too far, the attempt would fail unless the Magus's power was greater. Liam wanted to track Richard, but he was still worried about the boy's background. In fact, he had entered the dark forest after Richard, attempting to investigate the battle there, and the result had shocked him greatly. He realized that Richard actually possessed Ether Tier 3. How could he dare underestimate such a boy? He did not believe Richard was truly without background. His talent was simply too inconceivable. The background Liam suspected was not some powerful clan, but a powerful teacher. I suppose I must give up on the Cimera soil. Sigh, it's useless to me anyway, but I could trade it for something that is. Liam was the type who disliked getting involved in dangerous conflicts. Even greed found it difficult to push him into one. What he truly enjoyed was training in peace. That was why he chose to become the lord of a small city, even though he could have pursued a more honorable duty from the kingdom. Yes, it would be better to approach him as a friend. If he continues to grow and becomes very powerful, I could benefit from him. An idea sparked in Liam's mind, making his eyes gleam. After all, so many factions were eager to recruit Richard, including the Moonshadow clan. Wasn't it because they preferred to let him grow and become stronger first so they could reap the benefits later? But they did not know his appearance, only his name and age. Richard and Sister Lisa then stepped toward Lilith's residence, whose door had already been shut by the young lady and her maid. However, as they arrived before the door, it opened once more, revealing a woman who looked even younger than Sister Lisa. She seemed barely 20. She had long golden hair, a beautiful face with captivating blue eyes, and a pair of red lips shaped like a smiling heart. She wore a luxurious, tight red dress that did nothing to conceal her alluring curves. Richard had been wondering what kind of woman this Lilith would be. Unexpectedly, she was a stunning blonde, resembling a top Hollywood actress from Earth. "Lisa, you finally arrived," said the woman with a charming smile before lowering her gaze to Richard, since her tall figure towered over him. Her smile widened when her eyes locked on Richard. Her gaze was sharp, as if she were counting every strand of his hair. Somehow, Richard felt utterly horrified under her stare, as though she could see through every part of him, including his power. He did not doubt it. Even his instincts screamed at him to run. It wasn't a matter of whether the woman was good or evil, but her power was simply too overwhelming. Sister Lisa, unaware of what he was feeling, looked delighted to meet her old friend. "Lilith, it's been so long. You've changed so much after 10 years of wandering. I still remember clearly when you won the Young Magus tournament of the entire kingdom. It had everyone talking for weeks," she said. "But unfortunately, you vanished for so long. People even forgot about you and assumed you had died." As Sister Lisa spoke, Lilith turned her gaze back to her. "The outside world is far more fascinating, so I had no desire to return. Unfortunately, Something forced me to come back, and then I heard some Sky Armor Knights, who were once your friends, talking about you, Lilith said. But fortunately, it seems everything has been resolved well. By my estimation, if that issue hadn't been dealt with, you might have died. Sister Lisa gave a thin smile and instinctively glanced at Richard for a moment, for he was the one who had resolved that issue. On the other side, Richard finally realized why he felt such a great threat from this blonde woman. The champion of the tournament 10 years ago? #1 in the entire kingdom? Now, they were about to witness the finals across 3 provinces, with the winners being sent to the capital for the final stage. Considering that the Holy Star Kingdom had over 100 provinces, nearly 40 participants would be sent to the capital, each one a champion of 3 provinces. Even Ren, who was considered outstanding, was still far from being the #1 in the kingdom. Yet this blonde woman had once claimed that very title. After 10 years had passed, how could her strength not have grown drastically? Lilith, what was the matter that made you return? Sister Lisa asked, clearly curious. We'll talk about that later. For now, why don't you introduce me to this handsome and sturdy little boy? I think when he grows up, he'll suit my taste perfectly, Lilith replied, her eyes once again fixed on Richard, smiling and winking her left eye at him. Richard was stunned, his mouth falling open. Cough. Sister Lisa pretended to cough. Lilith, please don't joke around. He's only 7 years old, one of the children raised in my orphanage, she said, her tone sounding uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if he's still 7. 10 years later, he'll be 17. By then, he'll definitely suit me. Besides, even 10 years from now, I won't grow any older, Lilith replied without taking her eyes off Richard. So, how about it, handsome boy? Would you be interested in starting a special relationship with me when you grow up? If so, I'll give you something great as a gift, something that will surely help you a lot. Richard. Cough. 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 Sister Lisa coughed again. Richard, don't take Lilith's words seriously. She sometimes likes to spout nonsense just to mess with people's minds, she said. So his name is Richard. In that case, he must be the young magus who shocked Appletown by reaching the ethereal realm at the age of 7, Lilith said with a chuckle, while Sister Lisa could only show a helpless expression. From the start, she knew it was impossible to hide Richard's strength from Lilith, so there was no point in concealing his identity. She had originally hoped that by introducing Richard to Lilith, Richard could learn many things from her. But who would have thought that Lilith would be so insane, desiring Richard even though he was still a child? And here, Richard chose to hold his tongue. Lisa, where did you find him? I don't think some random person just dropped him off at your orphanage, Lilith asked. From my aunt, Lisa replied. Oh. Lilith suddenly looked very intrigued when she heard that Richard had been brought by her aunt. Of course, she knew Mrs. Wilson well. Ha ha. After that, she laughed spontaneously, then gestured for Richard and Sister Lisa to come inside. Come on, I'll show you the armor. But you really can control a Tier 8 sky armor, right? Of course. Even if my talent isn't that great, I keep moving forward, Sister Lisa replied. Your talent is still quite impressive by the city's standards. If only you hadn't quit the Sky Armor Legion, you might have advanced much faster, perhaps even already capable of controlling a Tier 11 armor, Lilith said. How could I not quit? That legion is filled with arrogant nobles who constantly exploit us knights from common backgrounds. Sister Lisa complained. Haha, it must have been tough for you. But with the armor I'm giving you, you can rise again, Lilith chuckled. Her house was rather dark since the windows were tightly shut, illuminated only by candlelight. Richard noticed many paintings hanging on the walls, all of them of crows, various kinds of crows, each with crimson eyes. Look, Lilith suddenly said before waving her hand. Something emerged from her storage artifact, a pitch-black female-shaped armor with small folded wings and a helmet in the shape of a crow's head. Faintly, the armor radiated an ominous black glow. Is this really a Tier 8 sky armor? Lisa asked. No, it's on a higher level, though someone can begin controlling it from Tier 8, Lilith answered. An armor with layered tiers, Sister Lisa muttered in shock. That's right. But the best part, This armor can transform into a giant crow with a shadow of hundreds of crows, Lilith said with a smile. Sister Lisa took a deep breath upon hearing that, staring at Lilith in disbelief. "Are you sure you want to give this to me?" she asked. This armor was undeniably too valuable. Normally, sky armors had no such special abilities. They were pure raw power. But this was special. In my hands, it's useless. And I'm too reluctant to sell it. It's better if I give it to my old friend. I'm sure you'll be able to bring out its full power one day, Lilith smiled. Come, drop your blood on the armor. I want to see it move, she added. Although Lisa considered the gift far too precious, when Lilith urged her to accept it, she no longer hesitated. With one of her long nails, she easily cut her own finger, letting the blood drip. She then placed the blood on the black armor with the crow helmet. Buzz. It shone, and the light swallowed Lisa before the armor separated into parts that simultaneously attached themselves to her body. Its size shifted, adjusting to Lisa's physique. When the light faded, the armor had fully merged with Lisa. But the first thing Lisa did was remove the armor's helmet. How does it feel? Lilith asked. So powerful. I doubt I'd have an opponent among Tier 8. But it seems I'll need training before I can transform into a crow, Lisa replied. At most, you'll need 24 hours, Lilith said. Yeah, Lisa agreed. By the way, you're not going to ask anything from me, right? Don't take me for that petty. Besides, I'm far too powerful already. Forget Tier 8. Even if you reach Tier 11, you still wouldn't be able to help me with my affairs. Lisa. Anyway, that armor can transform into a ring, and it also has internal space that functions as a storage artifact. So you won't have to walk around in full armor all the time, Lilith added. Lisa nodded. With a mere thought, the armor transformed into a ring that fit snugly on her finger. Without the armor, the oppressive aura she released vanished. In truth, if you needed help, I would surely lend it, Lisa said. Of course, her earlier words were just a joke. After being given something so extraordinary, how could she be so petty as not to return the favor? Speaking of help, maybe Richard can lend me his, Lilith said, causing Richard, who had been silent all this time, to raise an eyebrow. What do you want? Richard asked. Finally you speak. I thought you were mute. Lilith chuckled again, and Richard furrowed his brows. Lilith, what do you want from Richard? Lisa asked curiously. It's not anything troublesome, it's just training. Anyway, Richard's talent is too high. I want his help mastering an arcane art that I haven't been able to master at all until now. If Richard can master it even just a little, I want to see the power generated by that arcane art and receive that power attack. That should help me overcome the final hurdle of mastering it, since I feel like I'm so close, Lilith replied. What do you think, Richard? Do you have confidence? She asked. What kind of arcane art is it? Richard asked back, somewhat curious. This woman's talent should be extremely high. She probably also possessed a great soul, perhaps even more than one kind of soul. For her to be unable to master it at all. If that's the case, then even with the black heart soul, it might still be difficult for me to master it, Richard thought. Of course, it wasn't a serious problem since he had the system. Take a look. Lilith pulled out a book in response. I've already shared this with 10 geniuses who could have won the Magus tournament if they had been born in this kingdom, even with Lady Rebecca, who is considered a phenomenal talent here. Yet not one of them could master it. Richard quickly received the book, glancing at the title written on its cover. Mind Attack Arcane Art. What is this? He asked spontaneously, surprised by the words. As its name suggests, it attacks the mind. At its best, it can control the opponent's thoughts if they cannot resist it. And if they can, they'll still be forced to split their power, weakening their combat ability. This is an arcane art that requires intellect to master and doesn't rely on any elemental affinity, only one's mind, and everyone possesses that, Lilith explained. Something that shouldn't exist except in my own hands, Richard said while nodding, as he began to understand the arcane art. Both Sister Lisa and Lilith gave him an unblinking stare. He cleared his throat quickly, realizing how wrong his words had sounded. I mean our hands, he corrected himself with a wry smile. He had spoken that way by accident, since in his opinion this was an arcane art far too dangerous. After all, even if an enemy resisted its attack, they would still weaken by splitting their focus between fighting and defending their mind. Richard, I've always thought my man would be someone who harbors a selfish streak, since being kind like I've done only leads to being taken advantage of. But I think you're a little too early in developing that trait, Lilith commented. But her words only earned Richard a strange look from Lisa, which he immediately answered with a thin smile. That doesn't apply to you, Lisa. Besides, even though my help to you has always been invaluable, the times you've helped me far outweigh mine, he said with a chuckle. To be honest, I really did hope to make use of you. When you were still a nobody, when you were just a discarded princess with no detectable talent, I, who accidentally discovered your identity, deliberately helped you in the hope that you might miraculously change your fate, reveal the true talent of a princess, grow strong, and then I would benefit from your power. It was a gamble that I happened to win. If I had lost, perhaps I would have cursed you instead. Richard. He gave Lilith a strange look. Princess? Is she a princess of the kingdom? Still, he couldn't be bothered to think too much about it. The two women seemed to talk without restraint, but their friendship was clearly deep. He began flipping through the book. The first page contained a description, much as Lilith had explained, with the addition that for every 1% mastery gained, one could target one more person simultaneously. In other words, dividing the attack into two without diminishing its strength. If mastered to 100%, one could transform the mind attack into a vast domain that assailed everyone within it. It was somewhat unimaginable, yet the requirements were far too high. Although mastering an arcane art to 100% was easier than a codex, it was still extremely difficult. Richard wasn't sure if the system would grant him higher mastery if both his codex and arcane arts were already above 90%. After studying the description for a while, Richard flipped to the second page, beginning to absorb the book's contents. Ding! You have obtained the Mind Attack Arcane Art. Your mastery of Mind Attack has increased from 0% to 3%. Arcane Art. 100 Shadow Monster, 11%. Lighting of Darkness, 11%. Mind Attack, 3%. What do you think? Is there a chance you can master it? Lilith asked after he finished reading and pondering for a moment. Richard stared at her blankly, then replied, I need time to reflect. I can't say right now. That's fine. Just let me know if you ever manage to master it, Lilith said. You'd better not put too much hope into it, Richard replied. It's not that I'm obsessed with mastering this arcane art, but I need it to save someone. Who? Sister Lisa asked spontaneously, her eyes filled with curiosity. Though Richard had only just met Lilith, he was also somewhat curious. By his own reasoning, this arcane art could indeed be used to save someone. Any power could serve that purpose, like fire, which could help someone escape the cold. And this arcane art might help free someone from madness. Evan Moonshadow, Lady Rebecca's half-brother. Evan's mother was a werewolf. Unexpectedly, Evan inherited the alpha bloodline. Several accidents caused him to fail in returning to human form. The alpha bloodline, even for pure werewolves, requires careful control so it doesn't awaken before they reach a certain level. If it awakens prematurely, their power will skyrocket, but they'll become a bloodthirsty wolf, slaughtering everything until their energy is spent. Evan, having a human father, has even worse control over the alpha bloodline, and now he cannot return to his human form. Before long, he will eventually lose control. His power will surge to terrifying levels, but she will also descend into madness. At present, the Moonshadow clan keeps him imprisoned in their dungeon. But when Evan loses control, he might dig his way out from below. When that happens, even this city could be massacred. Do not underestimate the power of an alpha. In this city, I fear that aside from Lady Rebecca, no one could survive. Hearing all of this, both Richard and Sister Lisa fell silent. Who would have thought that this city, which seemed so prosperous and peaceful, was actually overshadowed by such a terrifying catastrophe? Oh, isn't he my uncle? Richard thought. Is that what brought you back home? Lisa asked. Yeah, I returned after receiving the news. In the end, I can't bear the thought of the city, the place where I was cast aside and grew up, being destroyed. If the worst comes to pass, I still have another trick to handle it, though at a steep price. Who else would take on this problem? People from other provinces certainly won't help, not even the kingdom itself. They'd all rejoice if the Moonshadow clan were in trouble. What about Lady Rebecca? Do you think she can't deal with it? Ha ha her. Lilith suddenly laughed. I respect her incredible talent, because even during my time outside the kingdom, I only met one person whose talent truly matched hers. She really did inherit her ancestors' legendary gift, Lilith said, pausing for breath before continuing. But who doesn't know her personality? In my view, she'd be the first to flee, as if she cares whether this city or her clan is destroyed. She has nothing but boundless ambition, consumed by the desire to obtain the world magic ether.